Does it work? Yeah. Hello, hi everyone. Welcome. My name is Daniel Kerner. I lead the Latin America team in Eurasia Group, and it's a pleasure to have you all for this very interesting event to discuss climate change, the global trends, and how this is affecting Latin America and the view from Latin America. We have very, very good and interesting speakers. And before I pass it on, I really want to thank the Americas Institute at Georgetown for hosting this, for all the effort and all the support that they give, and also Sempra Infrastructure for their support. And with that, let me stop and turn it over to Denise to talk more about the event. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I also want to welcome the people that are joining us online in this beautiful spring day here at Georgetown University. My name is Denise Yanovich. I'm the Managing Director of the Georgetown Americas Institute. And it's a pleasure to have you here to talk about how to overcome the challenges of climate change in Latin America. Briefly, I just want to introduce the Georgetown Americas Institute is a new institute at the university. So it was established in 2020. And we are a platform for dialogue, research, and impact around the key challenges facing Latin America and the hemisphere. It comes at a moment where our hemisphere is at a crossroads. Notable economic and social progress has been achieved since the 1980s. The region remains the most democratic in the developing world, and its democracies have shown resilience and vitality despite the challenging circumstances. Recently, however, there is growing evidence of democratic backsliding and economic instability and inequality in the Americas. Increasingly, citizens are taking to the street to express their discontent with the political and economic systems and governing elites. Incumbents and traditional political parties have not fulfilled citizens' expectations throughout the hemisphere. Citizens are demanding change. We are entering a pivotal decade for the Americas, and it will require greater engagement from interested parties to positively impact and devise solution. And Georgetown University is uniquely positioned to drive and contribute to discussions around fundamental issues for the future of the hemisphere. An important part of our programming includes organizing conferences like these to address the salient issues of the region. And we are delighted to host a distinguished group of panelists, and of course, Prime Minister Motley. Before turning it over to Alejandro Werner, who is the director of the Institute, I want to thank Kate Blanstead in our office for putting this together. She's done a fantastic job. And thank our partners, Eurasia Group, Sempra, Earth Commons, and the Global Human Development Program, as well as our student volunteers. Everyone that's helping out with this event is students. So thank you for being here, and Alejandro.
Thanks, Denise, and thanks everybody for joining us. I would like to introduce and to thank the Prime Minister Mia Mottley for being here with us today, and again at Georgetown to talk about climate change and how Latin America should address the challenges to fight climate change, to mitigate its impacts, and to adapt to the significant increase in the frequency of natural disasters that are affecting the region, and more importantly, the Caribbean. Prime Minister Mia Mottley became Barbados' 8th and first female Prime Minister on May 25th, 2018. Prime Minister Mottley was elected also to the Parliament of Barbados in September '94 as part of the new Barbados Labour Party government. Prior to that, she served as one of the two opposition senators between '91 and '94. Later, she served as Attorney General and Deputy Prime Minister of her country from 2001 to 2008. Not only has she been able to transform the Barbados economy, stabilize it, and put it on the right path towards inclusive growth, but she has become the most important voice in the climate change event discussion, representing small economies and emerging markets. So we're honored to have the Prime Minister with us today, and we'll give her the floor to address you on the challenges, how to overcome the challenges facing climate change in Latin America and the Caribbean. Mia, please.
Thank you, Alejandro. And first of all, let me thank you for the opportunity to be here this afternoon with you at Georgetown. It's good to be back again. And I say again because I spoke here last year, but I also say again because for 24 hours I was a student here. I tell this story all the time because having been accepted and having registered, I had just been nominated as a candidate 2 months before. And in the 24 hours after, I asked myself, what the hell am I doing here when I have a seat to go and win? And the rest is history. The example of cooperation and solidarity is really what is needed if we are going to be successful in fighting the battle, not just of our lives, but of humanity. And one of the things that makes it difficult is that we live in a world today where narrowcasting has become the order of the day as opposed to broadcasting, and where the inability to agree on the facts has therefore meant that the journey towards resolution and solution is just elusive. We have to recognize, however, that the example of last summer across Europe, the example of last winter across North America, bringing us within 30 degrees of the temperature on Mars, is sufficient warning that if these things have already started to happen and we have not reached 1.5, what is it likely to be? The Ecuadorian Minister of Foreign Affairs in the last day said something that was very instructive to me, and that is that the average person does not understand what 1.5 degrees means. That today, if I pull up my weather chart for DC, we're going to see the temperatures moving between 55 and 83 degrees. And that was the point that the Ecuadorian Minister of Foreign Affairs was making. So that we have to be careful that as we set out on this journey to be able to fight the battle of humanity, to save the planet, that we have as many people on board as possible. We need people on board at the domestic level, changing how we live, changing what we expect, and literally recognizing that how we have lived has been unsustainable, even for those who are not necessarily at the front line of the crisis. But regrettably, it means that all of us have to make the adjustment to this new life. It means cooperation among countries. The example within the Caribbean or within Latin America or within Central America of cooperation to protect oceans or to protect forests must be something that we continue to promote, because just as there is not enough public money to fight the battle globally, there is invariably not enough public money at the national and regional levels, and therefore we need to be able to have cooperation to push it as far as we can. Similarly, we need to have cooperation at the institutional levels, both in terms of the multilateral organizations that we have, but also most appropriately this week as we're discussing with the international financial institutions and the multilateral development banks. Because at the end of the day, what is being required is to build capacity to adapt to a new reality, to become more resilient for this new reality. And more often than not, most of us either do not have the money, or in some instances, do not even have the fiscal space to be able to borrow in order to be able to build that capacity. Because the crisis is being fought at the same time that we've had to fight other emergencies of a global nature, it makes it even more complex and more difficult. And that is why what the moment calls for now is solidarity for the call for transformation. It cannot be business as usual. and simply altering the equity to loan ratio of the World Bank from 20% to 19%, though applaudable, will not be enough. It is expected that that will unlock perhaps $50 billion over 10 years. But the numbers that are needed across the world are in the trillions. And trillions are still a concept that perhaps most of us have not accepted or contextualized appropriately. But suffice it to say, where I come from, you would say is a mob ton of money that is needed. And we say that recognizing that the reality of what is needed means that we have to look in different places to find it. Where are those different places? The world knew what it was to be able to come together in solidarity, to implement a global minimum corporate tax with alacrity and dispatch. And the example of how we did that should serve as inspiration for us to be able to deconstruct and reconstruct what is both the purpose of the World Bank and the origins necessary for its funding. By extension, once we do it at the level of the World Bank, there ought to be other adjustments made to ensure that the regional development banks can also step up to the plate to provide the level of funding necessary to build out new capacity. The world knew what it was to see two countries rush, as they should have, to be able to save private banks. But the reality is that if you can save private banks, and if you, as you should, and perhaps ought to, make those decisions to be able to say that these banks are too large to fail, then we ought to be making the same judgment about the planet. We are not yet aware of life being sustained for human beings on any other planet. How do we know those things and still not be prepared to deconstruct and to act with alacrity? Now, there's a danger as well of us focusing on the conversation as if there's a one-size-fits-all prescription. There is not. Whether we like it or not, Latin America and the Caribbean have been victims of exploitation and colonialism for centuries. And as a result, there was a clear development deficit that we found in a post-1945 world that has not been bridged. The reality of the relationship of power among those countries that governed before and after is still very much there. We only need to look at the structure of the Security Council to know where power resides globally. But what is needed now goes beyond simply those few countries. The problem is it starts with those few countries, because those few countries are the ones that have the power and the veto on the international financial institutions with the structure of their agreement that will make a difference. I want to ask, what is so different from 1969 that we cannot learn from 1969 when the IMF met to amend its Articles of Agreement to provide for special drawing rights? What is so different now that does not allow us to rise to the occasion to be able to change and modify and augment, rather, the mandate of the World Bank? A bank that was established to deal with reconstruction after the two great wars. A bank that understood that its mandate needed to extend to the elimination of poverty. But if we're going to be faithful to the elimination of poverty, it means stopping poor countries from being poor and poor people from being poor. One problem: 60 to 70% of poor people do not live in poor countries. They live in countries that are not poor. And therefore, if you have metrics that exclude middle-income countries, you run the risk of the pauperization of those countries. But worse than that, you run the risk that their failure to meet their demands to provide safety in terms of health systems or resilience in terms of climatic events means that they may end up adding to a global problem, not willingly, not deliberately, but purely because they can do no better, because the rules of the engagement for them by these international financial institutions do not allow for their circumstances to be seen, felt, or appreciated. We believe that Latin America and the Caribbean needs to stand together. In February of this year, we met CELAC, all of the countries with the exception of the United States of America and Canada of the Americas belongs to CELAC. We can get into another debate as to the relevance of OAS and CELAC and not getting our act together, but that's for another day. The important point is that the CELAC heads of government adopted the Bridgetown Initiative in, I believe, paragraph 10 of the Buenos Aires Declaration. And it did so not because of any other reason than all of us need the opportunity for the reform of the international financial institutions if we are to prepare to protect our people. How many countries throughout Latin America and the Caribbean have people living in precarious positions on hillsides that stand now to be affected and whose lives can be swept away overnight purely because of a flood that we did not know was going to happen? How many countries in Latin America and the Caribbean are threatened in terms of food security because of a lack of access to groundwater that hitherto may have been available? How many countries in Latin America and the Caribbean have started to explore and protect their marine environment, recognizing, as I say for my own country, we may be a small island developing state, and comfortably so, but we are equally a large ocean state at a time when oceans are the next frontier to save the planet. If we don't change our perspective and understand the richness and the majesty of what we have and the importance of working together, then we will be a victim of circumstances. We have a legitimate claim to being at the table to ensure that humanity is preserved. This region has already been the site of the worst genocides known in the last millennium. It is up to us to ensure that that is not replicated. And the only way we will do it is by acting in solidarity. I do believe that that moment has arrived because there is no politics in the saving of the planet ultimately. The only thing that is common with politics and planet is that they both begin with the letter P. And we need to understand that and appreciate it and move beyond the division that we would normally accommodate in national and hemispheric politics to recognize that we have no option. You cannot sit back and do nothing. The bottom line is that I have every confidence that our scientists globally are working quickly. I've just come back from Silicon Valley. I've seen the kinds of exciting work that is being done to be able to mitigate the consequences of the climate crisis and to be able to buy us as much time as possible. But we need to build better and differently, and we need to engage differently. Now, I want us to remember that while I'm speaking to you in a university and in an academic environment, this is not an academic discussion. And that if you sit as the head of government, you have to provide for your people, and people must eat each and every day. If not, you are going to have social instability and loss of life, loss of livelihoods. Same time, we are not a one-issue race. The human being is also capable of dying from poverty, from violence, and from many other things. And if we are to be faithful to our determination to protect people, then we cannot separate climate from development or climate from poverty. It is the same discussion. I say so because we are at risk of people believing, one, that zealotry should dominate, and that because we want to make sure that we can get to that ideal position, that we ignore what is necessary to sustain our people along the road to getting there. Why do I say so? Even the International Energy Agency recognizes that a post-2050 net zero world will still have to have some level of fossil fuels. The issue is, will it be clean? Will it be natural gas? Can we move from natural gas into green hydrogen more appropriately and amply? What will be the technological developments that will allow us other options as we go forward? But the ball reality is that because the world has yet to deliver on the 100 billion promise for adaptation, and because the world is yet, even though it is now moving in that direction, to bring about reform in the IFIs, what will we use to sustain our populations in the interim? And that is why much of the countries who are involved still in fossil fuel extraction make the case not just for a just transition, but for a recognition of the disparity in circumstances that is being foisted upon them by those who say no new drilling, no new nothing. I can report to you that my own country will eventually go to the market very shortly to deal with natural gas, not oil. Now we are immediately conscious that by saying natural gas alone and not oil, that we immediately reduce the number of companies who may be interested in exploiting our maritime space. But equally, we are also counting on state-to-state partnerships that may increase it on the basis of having an option for the future. Or alternatively, there may even be a pool of capital that says, pay countries to keep it in the ground. Bottom line is, it drives into sharp focus the reality that nobody has turned up to the dance to help those countries that have been on the front line of the crisis, paying the price for it, incurring debt for it, paying for the preservation of our coastal environment to protect communities that would otherwise be affected, but at the same time being accused of being highly indebted and not having sufficient space to be able to pursue other aspects of development. It cannot work. And if we are to be honest, we need to recognize that part of the deficiency of the COP process, and the UNFCCC knows this, is that when the cameras and the lights are on, everybody will make the commitments, but we are not sufficiently pausing to link capacity to commitment and to ensure that when I say in Barbados that we want to have a tax holiday for electric or hybrid vehicles, that we can actually source the vehicles, rather than being told that we can't export to your country because we don't even have enough for our region. Or when we say that we need to move to renewable energy across the board for electricity generation, that we are not told that we don't have access to the batteries. The irony is that some of the major producers of lithium in the world are Chile, Bolivia, Argentina, but are we the beneficiaries of the finished product? And therefore, we cannot move forward in this discussion about adjusting to a climate crisis world without talking about a just industrial strategy and the transfer of technology, as well as the leveling and lowering of capital, the cost of capital for the global South. These are the issues that continue to dominate our attention. It will work, but what is the one problem from everything I've said this evening, this afternoon? It is the absence of political will of a few countries of the world who can make the difference by giving instructions to their shareholding representatives in the IFIs and in the multilateral organizations. What is going to tip everything? What's going to move the needle? Another summer and another winter and another set of wildfires like we've seen in the last year. And we have 2 to 3 more years of that. The biggest support for the global South will come from ordinary people in the global North. Today, I speak to you, having read stories of Italy declaring a state of emergency because of the issue of migration in their own country. Every time we see boats capsizing and lives being lost, it ought to prick our conscience. But regrettably, it's just become another scene on another social media site or news media site. We have to stop being desensitized from the loss of life, because the next loss of life may not be someone who we don't know, but maybe our very neighbors in our region. And I believe that we do not have to wait until the end comes or the worst is before us before we get up and act. The reason why you are here at these universities is to be able to learn the power of reason and the power of choice. It is up to you to help spread the message and to ensure that it is not just a handful of people carrying this battle, but it is the majority of our populations, not as a form of zealotry, as I said, but as a form of balanced, reasonable discussion that allows us to bring real progress and real resilience to people and not just conversations that sound good. I hope and pray that those of you who constitute the leadership of your countries, our countries in Latin America and the Caribbean, will understand that there is a price to arrogance. And the arrogance that will cause us to believe that societies and civilizations don't fail is one that can be immediately penalized, because the evidence of failed civilizations is all over our history books. And the evidence that species don't become extinct is not a figment of our imagination. It is real. And if we believe that we can be exempt from this future, then you can roll that dice, but I'm not rolling it with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Prime Minister Motley, for such an important speech. And the Prime Minister has time for... Well, I don't know. Okay. Thanks, Prime Minister. The Prime Minister has time for 2 questions, so we will take both of them, and then you will answer them. Yeah. Thanks.
I wish I had more time to be with you, but they have us on a roller coaster today. Thank you.
Hello, Prime Minister Motley. I'm Kalia. I'm a student here in the Global Health Program. And I just wanted to know, earlier you stated that the oceans were going to be instrumental in combating climate change. And also you talked about your trip to Silicon Valley and getting a peek into what they're working on there. What can you tell us about the role of oceans in addressing this climate change issue?
Well, to begin with, that we know less about oceans than we should know. And the reality is that the learning curve is really only now starting. What we do know is that we've seen too much loss of diversity on land. We've seen an exhaustion of resources on land. And in a sense, we are hoping that in the ultra deep, the areas that we've not yet researched will give us opportunities. Carbon sequestration is not quite yet where it needs to be in terms of ocean capture. But we are confident that in the same way people spoke to renewable energy, photovoltaic panels not being economic 15, 20 years ago, or other things not being ready, green hydrogen isn't quite where we need it to be, that the scaling up and the commercialization will lead to improvements in technology and by extension, improvements in access to materials that can make a difference to the quality of life that we have. In a sense, we are rolling the dice on that, but I think there's a lot of initial research that gives people comfort that there's much more to be found in the ocean than on land. I'll say one last thing. When you go on a plane, look at the map again. And when you look at the maps that they now provide in Technicolor, look and see how much of the Earth's land is brown and how much remains green. It is frightening. Any next question? Thank you.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Oh, sorry.
I'll do 3 just to do quick ones then. Go ahead.
Thank you.
I'll come
Thank
to you
you.
and then you. All right.
Okay. Daniela Stevens at the Inter-American Dialogue. What is your hope and what is your expectation about the newly created Loss and Damage Fund? What do you see coming out of it? Is it just one more drop in the bucket, or do you see something bigger coming out of it? And what will be your message for countries at the spring meetings?
Well, if you want to maintain trust between the global north and the global south, then we need to make loss and damage funds real, and we need to make the adaptation fund real. People do not accept that you can miraculously find money for Ukraine, as you should, but you can't find money for loss and damage, especially when the evidence is clear that 80% of the G20 countries are responsible. By the same token, I believe that the reform of the World Bank ought to be informed not just by public money, which we all agree is not sufficient, and the minister from Uruguay will speak, I'm sure, of her innovations with respect to interest rate step down opportunities. But beyond that, we believe that we need to bring multinational corporations to the table as well, not to punish them, but to be able to say, look, all of us are in this battle together. And we need each of us to leave something on the table and walk out like men and women afterwards. But we cannot lift this weight alone. The countries of the world are not yet even committed to ensuring that the commitment of 0.7 for ODA has been met. And yet we are in this position. So that if we can find the energy to have the global minimum corporate tax, then we can certainly find a way that those who contributed to the need for a global commons, whether it is with respect to climate or biodiversity loss, whether it is respect to pandemic, the COVID-19, or indeed the silent killer, slow motion killer of antimicrobial resistance, or whether it is digital divide that is leading to human insecurity across continents, or whether it is basic food and water security. We need to be able to have multinational corporations, in addition to governments, start to contribute to the creation and maintenance of the global commons. And it does not need to be disproportionate, it does not need to be arduous, but it needs to happen. Why? The more that do it, the lower the incidence. And the more that do it, the more we can ensure that while we do well in particular countries, we're not the victim of those countries who could not come and step up to the plate purely because of lack of access to funds. We also believe that philanthropic capital should leave something for the global commons as opposed to that only which they want to direct. They're only philanthropic capital because they've already benefited egregiously from the capitalist system that we have globally. So this is not intended to name and shame anybody. This is not intended to blame anybody. But this is intended to recognize a precept that we learned as children. Many hands make light work. And if we are not prepared to come to the table, leaving something at the table, then we run the risk of sowing our own demise and that of our children and grandchildren. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, Prime Minister.
Thank you.
And thank you for issuing the clarion call for action. You've just about answered what I was going to ask you, which is, I'll ask it again anyway in case you want to expand. What would be a great agenda that SIDS and everybody else would want to see in the pre-COP and in the COP, let's say, that institutions like this research business school could undertake? What do we need more? You've listed quite a bit this afternoon.
As I said earlier, I mean, just now I spoke to you about the proper funding for the World Bank to help in the maintenance of a global commons. But I equally spoke to you just now about the fact that a lot of what is needed to save the renewable energy revolution is in fact available in Latin America. Bolivia, Chile, Argentina all have strong deposits of lithium. But at the end of the day, why is it that we're not having a just access to industrialization that will allow us to be able to ensure that our populations benefit? Because the system is not structured in that way. And we need, therefore, to not only look at access to funding, but we need to look at how we can deconstruct how our industrialization is taking place and how we can transfer technology as well as capital at the same cost from the north to the south in order to ensure manufacturing capacity and therefore access to markets. If we don't have that, then what happened with the pandemic, with the vaccine apartheid, will just happen again, but this time with respect to renewable energy or different other aspects that are critical to us to help us mitigate against the climate crisis. Okay?
Prime Minister
Thank you very
Modley,
much. And
thank
God
you
bless.
again.
Take care.
Thanks.
And then just make sure to turn your mic on. Yeah.
Okay, so we move to our first panel on this conference on overcoming challenges to fight climate change. Today we have, a great set of panelists. First of all, Azucena Arbeleche has been the Minister of the Economy and Finance of Uruguay since March 1st, 2020. Before that, she was an independent consultant in debt management and also the head of the debt management unit in Uruguay in previous government. She has been the president of the Development Committee of the World Bank until very recently, and she has led one of the most advanced ESG financing strategy in emerging markets. Secondly, Helen Meirovich is the head of Climate Change Advisory Service Division at the Inter-American Development Bank, the BidInvest, which she joined in 2017. She's responsible for developing innovative strategies and implementing solutions to reduce the impact of climate change. She has extensive experience in creating favorable conditions for environmentally friendly investments and leveraging international climate funds that help channel private investment to the region. Third, Lupin Rahman is an executive vice president and portfolio manager in the New York office of PIMCO Investment Management. She oversees PIMCO's sovereign credit investment on the emerging markets portfolio management team and is responsible for environmental, social, and governance integration across PIMCO's investment strategies. Prior to joining PIMCO in 2018, she spent 5 years at the International Monetary Fund as an emerging market macroeconomist. Dan Selico is chair of the governing board of JP Morgan Development Finance Institution, where I think he used to lead a team, no?
As of 2 weeks ago, I'm not.
Okay, but that's what he used to do. Now, he will tell us what he's doing now, but he used to lead this team. He put together this division at JP Morgan, and he also led JP Morgan's business with public sector clients such as central banks, sovereign wealth funds, public pensions, governments, and their agencies, and international financial institutions. From 2015 to 2022, he co-founded and co-headed a global team responsible for providing financing, structuring, and advisory services to the firm's clients, involving sponsoring and investing in infrastructure around the world. And he also used to be, I think it's called the deputy president or the first vice president of the IDB many administrations ago with President Luis Alberto Moreno. I don't have it here, but that's well, that's where we met. So it tells a little bit, not only his age, but also mine. So with that, we will start. First, Azucena will speak a little bit from the point of view of a country, how she and her team have actually designed and implemented an ESG strategy. And secondly, from or using her hat that she previously had as the chairperson of the Development Committee, her ideas on how IFIs should be moving forward this agenda. Then Helen will give us her ideas on how the IDB and other IFIs can help in structuring financing to actually leverage the private markets to significantly multiply the effects of policy on climate change. And then we will hear from two market participants from Lupin's side, from a portfolio manager's point of view, actually how do you design a strategy to basically help mobilize this fund? And from an investment market perspective, how do you put these two sides together, the clients that have the funds and the clients that need the funds to implement significant infrastructure investment, and within infrastructure, infrastructure geared towards climate change. So with that, I'll give the floor to Azucena, and then I will just control the flow of speeches.
And this is the difficult part, how to, hello? Hello, yes, so I got the difficult part done. Okay, good evening, good afternoon, everybody. It's really an honor to be here, to be in this audience and in this panel, and to share with this audience with you. Thank you, Alejandro, for the invitation. So let me share a little bit about Uruguay's case. Our government is very much committed to climate action and conservation of nature. So from the beginning of this administration, in our budget law, we added an article where we spoke about mainstreaming environmental policy into our economic policy. So we can't see this as two different policies. They both have to come together. Uruguay has taken concrete steps in this environmental and economic policy. And let me at this point tell you that for the Ministry of Economy and Finance, it's not only important to address environmental challenges because we care about our people, our citizens, the citizens from the whole planet, but as economic policymaker, we have to consider that we are facing a complete change in the paradigm in which goods are produced, services are traded, investment is made. So if as policymaker, as economic policymaker, our ultimate goal is to have more jobs and well-paid jobs, then we have to look forward and incorporate today environmental issues in the way we invest, in the way we produce, in the way we trade. So it's also, that's very important with that perspective, is that we sit in the Ministry of Economy and Finance, and together with the other ministries, the whole government pushes forward with this idea. So Alejandro was asking what we did in terms of financing and this idea of incorporating environmental policy into economic policy. We think that it's very strategic to align incentives so that the cost of funding is related to the environmental behavior that a country does. And right from the beginning, and now I'm changing, I'm sharing the two views, my hat as Minister of Economy in Uruguay and my former hat as chair of the DC, because really with the team, we discussed both topics at the same time. So back in 2021, we presented in the co-chair that I had with Mia Motley, Uruguay presented the idea that the different countries, when they contribute to the production of global public goods, they should receive a different treatment. And again, this treatment should be in terms of different access or better access to markets, but also different and better cost of funding. So with this idea, we worked in Uruguay for many months, and finally, at the end of last year, we issued a global bond, a sovereign sustainability-linked bond in the capital markets, where the interest rate of the bond is linked to two key performance indicators that come from the Paris Agreement. So from all the NDCs 1 that we had, that Uruguay presented in the Paris Agreement, we chose two of them. The first one is the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, and the second one is the conservation of native forestry. These indicators were chosen after a lots of conversation with investors, and especially the second one that speaks about biodiversity and conserving nature. This was something that we hadn't thought about at the beginning, but it came from the investors as a very important point. So the scheme that we have in the bond is a two-way coupon. If Uruguay outperforms the targets, then we have a step down. That means we pay less interest payment. If Uruguay, on the contrary, doesn't reach the targets, we have a step up and we have to pay a higher interest rate. That is the way that the bond works. Previously, early in the year, Chile had issued a bond which only had a step up. In the case of Uruguay, we chose a two-way coupon, so there's a step up and also a step down. And we were very successful with the bond in terms of pricing, in terms of the demand that we faced. In fact, we had many new accounts. I would say 25% of the investors were new accounts to Uruguay. So that was very productive also in terms of diversifying the investor base. And we did a lot of work with other, with different multilateral institutions, because of course you have to be very careful to choose your indicators. You have to have a second party opinion that says how ambitious your indicators are. You have to have somebody measuring, verifying, validating what you measure. So we worked a lot with the United Nations Development Program in this regard. This is in terms of our bond issued last year. Let me now go back to the second part of what I understood of Alejandro's question. How can we link this to, how can we scale up this idea not only for Uruguay, but for the challenges that we are facing in terms of environment that my colleague Mia previously pointed out? Well, we think that we could have a similar instrument in terms of not a bond, but a loan dispersed from a multilateral institution. And in that regard, we have been working for many months now with the World Bank. We are also working with the IDB and maybe with some other institution in bringing up a similar design. In the case of the World Bank, we are thinking of an instrument where that I would say that fits perfectly well to what the World Bank has presented as the evolution framework of the World Bank Group. This is something that this week during the IMF and World Bank spring meetings, we have been discussing a lot so far, and we will continue. This afternoon, we will have the development committee, and this is the topic that's going to be in the agenda. How can the World Bank help in addressing the climate challenges, in addressing climate mitigation and adaptation? So the instrument, this financial instrument that we have been working with the staff of the World Bank is a loan, again, linked, the interest rate of the loan is linked to two key performance indicators. In this case, we are working with the reduction of methane emission from the livestock, and again with natural forestry, with the conservation of natural forestry. The interesting feature in this case is that we are not having a two-way coupon, but we have only a step-down coupon. So for when a country contributes to the global public good, if a country fulfills the commitment that has been chosen as the key performance indicator, they have to pay less interest. We don't have a pay up. And this is very important. We only speak about positive incentives. And this makes a whole difference when we look at this from the point of view of the multilateral. It's also very important who pays for this pay down. Because if the World Bank disperses a loan to Uruguay, if Uruguay meets the targets, then Uruguay will pay less interest. Well, what happens with the balance sheet of the bank? Who pays that? And this is a very important discussion that's also going on this week and will continue. Currently, we are working so that the step down is funded by a fund that the World Bank has, a global public good fund. And we hope that that fund is replenished by outside countries, by donors. So my point is that we are working so that the funds don't come from the balance sheet of the multilateral. Why? Because if it is the balance sheet of the multilateral that supports that the step down, that means that all shareholders equally, they are all contributing for this step down. And we want those countries that are more developed, that have higher income, that have contributed more in the emissions, in greenhouse gas emissions, to contribute more now in addressing the climate problem. So we think that this instrument fits very well to the current challenges and fits very well to the evolution framework that is currently discussed. So there are other characteristics. I think that I will stop here and give way to the other panelists. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Azucena. And I think also it's a very, hopefully it will be a very clever way to channel the resources that the international community is putting in several funds, and it has been hard for emerging markets and developing countries to access, trying to access them through the kind of structures that the World Bank is putting together and making it easier for the whole community of developing economies to access them. But with that, let me turn it to Helene to talk about challenges in the region and how the IDB is helping them, and IDB Invest is helping them to overcome it.
Thank you, Alejandro, for the introduction, and thank you for inviting me to be part of the panel. Similar to Mia Motley, I was a graduate here at Georgetown, so it was nice to be back at Georgetown. So let me just start by saying that, you know, when we think about Latin America and the Caribbean and the challenges of climate change, of course we know that the region has been hit by droughts, by wildfires, by rising temperatures, by changing precipitation patterns that has impacted even crop production, even in my own country, in Argentina. And so the recent report of the IPCC that was released in March that calls for urgent action is not of a surprise, of course. But what it says is that the resources are out there. We know that there are trillions of dollars in savings that need to be channeled for climate action. And specifically for the region, we need to mobilize between 4 to 8 times the resources that we currently mobilize for climate action. Just to give you a sense, in 2022, as IDB Group, not only the private sector part, which I work in, but also the public sector part, we lent $7.8 billion for climate action. But that's a drop in the bucket compared to what's really needed for climate action. We're talking about, in a recent estimation on the NDC implementation for the region, is between $430 billion to $2.5 trillion yearly from 2030 onward if we want to reach a net zero world. So that's a lot of resources. And so on the one hand, we know that the scale of the resources are there, but we do have an advantage as an MDB, or working even in the public sector and the private sector, and the synergies between the different windows, to work with governments to establish the policies that can unlock more resources and private sector investment, and can work with the private sector to generate the knowledge, the information, the conditions for the private sector to then replicate once the model is set and proved to be moved to scale. And also we have another important tool that is to redirect or try to incentivize resources to go towards Paris Agreement. That's why from January 1st, 2023, all of our new operations in the public and the private sector are going to be Paris aligned, and that the guidelines on what it means for IDB Group to be Paris aligned were just released yesterday. So you can go on the website and you can see what it means. But the bottom of it is that we want to help transition to a low carbon and resilient economy. Our role is to support private clients and governments to do this transition together. And it depends on the conditions of each country. As you know, the UNFCCC talks about common but differentiated responsibilities. What it basically means that each country has different capacities and abilities to achieve their goal in the Paris Agreement. And so we want to work with our clients to support that transition. So how do we do that in IDB Invest? So I think that we have three main areas of work that we try to promote within climate action. First, and one topic that is very important for us, is to work with financial institutions. Even large financial institutions are co-lenders like JP Morgan or PIMCO, but also domestic capital markets. We need to work with financial institutions, financial intermediaries, microfinance institutions, to teach them and to work with them into designing sustainable strategies. And not only on the climate angle, but also on the social angle. I think that for Latin America, working together, the social and the climate angle is very, very important, because just transition is a concept that is very relevant for the region as well. So working with financial institutions and promoting sustainable investments is very important, and it's one of the lines of work, where we also developed new asset classes like thematic bonds, and those thematic bonds can be green, can be blue, can be sustainability linked bonds or outcome-based bonds, but it's basically doing the structure to promote a specific outcome or performance. The second line of action has to do with testing new business model, investing in technologies, working in green hydrogen or bifacial solar panels or wind farm, offshore wind farms, etc. So it's just trying to see from the mitigation point of view, what are the technologies that can be promoted in the region, and how can we bring other actors, other big banks that may not have the capacity to have a view or the ESG due diligence capacity that we have being across the region, and so work with them to have a joint and collaborative process and product, a financial product at the end. So that would be the second line of action. And the third line of action that we do in this whole strategy that we call investing in reversing is adaptation. I think that the region, as we heard before, resiliency is critical for the region, and working in incorporating resiliency and identifying, because many times the private sector companies that we have, they are doing resiliency or they are doing adaptation, but they haven't called it that way. Working with them to identify what's resiliency and trying to put a price to that, it's very important to support resiliency in the region. In addition to the specific investments, we're working in the public sector with providing hurricane law clauses for stopping the principal payments when a hurricane hits a country. And in the private sector, we have what we call the climate clause, which is also another way to support private sector companies to recover after a natural disaster hit. So that's our general strategy, but in the conversations that we've had across all the MDBs, and because we know that in Sharm el-Sheikh implementation plan was the first time that IFIs were called to think about how can we mobilize more resources, one of the conversations we've had across MDBs is that we need to work at country level. We need to design country level platforms where we can talk to each other and see how can we combine the work between all the MDBs that work, for example, in the case of Uruguay, and how can we complement each other to get the best result and outcomes in the country. And so that's one of the proposals that we have moving forward as MDBs. And finally, as IDB Invest specifically, we have learned a lot about mobilization. We have learned a lot what it takes to mobilize more private capital in the region, and we want to use that further. We want to be the conduit of private capital to investment, and so we are currently in conversations to increase our capital to be able to do more of that. So with that, I'll pass it on to Dan.
Thanks, Helen. So we'll turn it to Lupin Rahman. She will discuss PIMCO's ESG investment strategy, its execution in LATAM, and any comments on the role of MDBs.
Okay, thanks very much. So for everyone's information, as background, PIMCO is an asset management company. We're focused on fixed income investments. We have about 1 trillion in assets under management. And out of that, about 700 billion is linked to sustainable investment strategies. So as we look to the amount of assets that we manage with sustainability or ESG-linked strategies in mind, there are a couple of factors which have driven us in our thinking of how to approach investing. I think the primary and key focus is the need for our asset owners, the institutions and retail investors that give us the money to manage, essentially has been a focus on ESG-related investment strategies. And that overwhelming theme is a key driver of the work that we do on climate change and other ESG-related investments. A second key driver is regulation. And regulation globally is moving at different paces, but regulation in terms of what our regulators from the financial authority perspective request in terms of risk mitigation in portfolios and scenario stress testing are critical factors in terms of how asset managers like PIMCO approach ESG and climate-oriented investing. And the third is this very large need to meet the climate challenges that the global south and the globe as a whole are facing. And in our work, that really comes in the form of issuers that are looking for financing. So these three factors really have evolved over time, and it really is over the last decade where we've seen a significant acceleration in all three in culminating and focus on investing for climate change and ESG. So how do we do this in practice? So in practice, what we do at PIMCO is essentially work on our inbuilt frameworks, and essentially we're scoring all issuers that come to the market on ESG criteria. And then we're focusing on assessing whether the financing that is required for the projects that are in mind are essentially return giving relative to our index. That has several challenges in terms of catalyzing new additional financing for climate change, especially given the kind of sums that are involved. And I think the first big challenge is a big proportion of the financing that is needed is coming from the global south. Why is that a challenge? It's a challenge because investors and asset owners really allocate assets according to various categories like emerging markets or investment grade strategies. A lot of asset owners are not focused on investing in emerging markets. You saw last year about $85 billion in outflows from the EM dedicated asset class as a whole. Why is that important? It's important because when we have assets to manage under sustainability linked strategies, those asset owners actually tell us which kind of assets we should be investing in. So if there is a bit of a bias strike against emerging markets, you have a problem because essentially those are the countries where there's the greatest need. So that's a really big obstacle to be able to get over when it comes to thinking about how asset managers are going to essentially plug the gap between where the need is and essentially where asset owners want to invest. I think the second challenge really is one of the lack of instruments. And this may sound a bit astonishing just given the growth of the green bond and ESG labeled market, but there is a significant lack of instruments in this field relative to the amount of AUM that is managed against ESG types of strategies. And we see this particularly in emerging markets. So, look at the growth of the green bond market. You have a significant skew towards investment grade corporates, most of them domiciled in Europe or the US and in China. But you really don't have a significant skew from the sovereign side, and you don't have a significant skew in EM corporates. We actually have a few in the Latin American region, but just globally, when you look at the numbers involved, you have quite a dearth of instruments. So what are the challenges in terms of trying to improve that? I think there are quite a few, but I do see progress in Latin American region. For example, regulations in places like Brazil, Chile, Mexico, where really you're moving towards a sustainability types of disclosures in the corporate sector is something that is quite significant and is very helpful. The work that many countries are doing through their central banks in greening the financial sector is extremely helpful, because it means that not only do banks look to issue more green-oriented instruments, they're also looking to green their own books. And so that opens up the kind of instruments that investors like PIMCOs of the world can actually invest in. The other positive trends that we're seeing is this development of green frameworks and green taxonomies in some of the sovereigns in Latin America. And all of this essentially is building out the kind of ESG and climate-oriented infrastructure that is out there that will eventually lead to greater issuance in this space. I think the biggest challenge from the perspective of the sovereign and quasi-sovereign issuers that we speak to is essentially one of technical capacity. Many countries it really boils down to their debt management offices that look at ESG-linked financing, and they simply don't have the bandwidth or the technical capacity to really focus and be able to put together green frameworks, sustainability-linked frameworks. Sometimes there isn't political will, and even if there is political will, I think just this technical capacity issue is a significant barrier in many countries. Latin America is not unique in this. I look at global sovereigns, and this is an issue that we face across the world. It is notable that Latin America has had several countries that have issued SLB and ESG labeled instruments. And so that is one area where we see progress in LATAM versus other emerging markets. But this is where I do see a significant role for the IFIs in terms of stepping in and assisting some of the countries, particularly in the lower end of the income spectrum, to really move up the kind of ESG ladder in terms of their infrastructure. Let me stop here and pass it back. We can have questions that we can answer.
Perfect. Thank you, Lupin. And I'll turn to Dan Selico, who will discuss JP Morgan's development finance institution vision for the private sector role in developing finance, and mostly in climate change and its involvement in operations in Latin America. Dan?
Sure, thanks Alejandro. Let me make clear that we have a lot of climate-related activities going on as a company, and I'm not going to get into most of them. We've kind of signed on to the Glasgow GFANZ net zero commitment on the part of that's being led by Mark Carney, which causes us to seek to be net carbon neutral in our activities. We now have something equivalent to a balance sheet committee, but for carbon, that allocates the kinds of deals that we can do given the carbon intensity of the various sectors. We also are greening our company itself. I mean, don't forget, we're a big company, 275,000 people. I think we're the largest private sector employer in several big cities around the world. We have 22 office buildings in New York alone, and I promise you that sets off a lot of carbon. So we are very much focused on reducing the carbon footprint of being JP Morgan. Having said that, let me talk a little bit more about clients and what we're doing with clients and the approach that we're doing to precipitate more carbon finance, but through a development finance lens, because we look at carbon as both mitigation and adaptation and resilience as being part and parcel of the development process. So sure, we've been doing a lot of green deals over the past 2 years, and I share the view with Lupin that kind of it does seem to be taking off. You know, my team gave me a whole list of just the ones we've done in LATAM in the past 2 years, you know, be it, green bonds for a Guatemalan energy company that achieved a 15% gain in energy efficiency, green debentures for a water and sanitation company in Brazil that apparently is improving coverage across 64 municipalities. An Argentine telecoms operator we're doing a green loan for that reduced its energy consumption by 58%. And of course, we were honored to be part of the sustainable linked bond that Azucena described, which was really a magnificent achievement on their parts. And you know, there's a list that's about 10 or 15 long more. The point about all of these is that they have specificity. They're about specific outputs and outcomes. So what we tried to do is to take that notion to say, can we extend what had taken the green bond world or the green finance world some 15 years to evolve into? Can we accelerate that in the world of development finance and at the same time overcome some of the problems that we see in the green bond world or the green finance world in appealing to emerging market issuers, which, as Lupin pointed out, in some ways, the frameworks that have been established favor developed countries. And so we agreed with the International Finance Corp, the private sector lending arm of the World Bank, we signed an MOU with them, and essentially what we wanted to do is to take their impact framework, they call it AIM, Anticipated Impact Measurement something, applied it to our much broader range of products and services, because after all, we have a securities license, we're not just a bank. And if we codify, systematize, get really transparent, and help our clients really dig deep to anticipate the impacts that they're expecting, and then report on them in a way that's measurable and monitorable, and reported regularly, would some good things happen? So fast forward, January 2020, we launched the JP Morgan Development Finance Institution to test that proposition. We really didn't know if it was going to work or not. So the DFI at JP Morgan has essentially 3 parts to its strategy. The first is to appeal to investors who want to see development impacts, but also want to be sure that these are real and transparent. And by the way, development impacts as well as financial returns. We are not at this point claiming or asking for any financial concessions from anybody. But we're saying that there's a growing cadre of investors that care about both. And we want to take advantage of that dual interest to help our issuer clients capture greater demand, which ultimately we believe will translate into a lower cost of finance for them. But for the time being, all we can claim is that it's for sure taking in a much broader swath of the investor community. So first is to appeal to investors through standardization and transparency and reporting. Second, it's to attract more issuer clients that want to explain why their use of other people's money is actually developmental. So in effect, it's a kind of, if you will, and this isn't just so that they can sell more bonds or get better pricing on their loans or on other products, but it's so that they can also hold themselves more accountable for why they're using third-party money. And then the third is that because we derived this methodology with the aid and support of some of the world's top development institutions, we thought that by having very similar frameworks to what they use to assess development impact and effectiveness, that would make us a better partner with them and therefore do more deals with them. So, since its founding in 2020, JP Morgan has qualified a sum total of $368 billion of transactions through the end of 2022 that carries characteristics that I've just outlined around development finance. And I also should have mentioned that all in our methodology, which is on our website, every transaction that we're characterizing as development finance can be traced back to one or more of the UN SDGs. That's the framework we prefer to use because we believe it's pretty widely accepted. This 368 billion number was comprised of 1,732 transactions across banking, investment banking, and markets activities. All of it involves some sort of new financing. It's not sales and trading. It's not kind of secondary markets. It's not operating services or anything like that. And it's covered most industries. Beyond this, our DFI team works actively with issuer clients and they've closed 41 deals so far using this methodology across products ranging from bonds to loans to structured trade to equity to M&A, and even a few risk management transactions, that is hedges of financings. And so they helped these clients think carefully about the types of development impacts that they'd be seeking, to design the reporting arrangements, to create appropriate disclosures in the offering documents. And it's actually led to the creation of a product in the markets called a development impact assessment, which the clients are free to publish. And it's written up in their offering memoranda. And as I say, every development impact assessment is tied back to one or more of the SDGs. And so we've now got a pipeline that's similarly sized. And I should say that, the numbers are really big, not because we're so smart, but because we're so big. That, we've got kind of a footprint all over the world. And what we find ourselves doing is we're appealing to those investors that are finding a shortage of instruments in which they can invest that Lupin had mentioned. We're creating instruments that they can realistically view as, hey, this is legit, and we're kind of tightening up our methodology all the time, often with the direct engagement of our investor clients who are giving us feedback on kind of what makes sense to them, what's rigorous enough for them, so that we can make sure that we're kind of creating something that they want. I want to make just a few other observations about our approach. First is that there are many different types of structures, whether it's green bonds or social bonds or thematic bonds of other sorts. Ours is not a use of proceeds approach, which you might hear from time to time, but rather it's one that's focused on the outputs and the outcomes of the issuer on development indicators that it chooses to pursue. Second, it's a purely commercial approach. There's no financial concessions involved. And one of the sad truths about the world is that kind of emerging markets in developing countries, and particularly companies and people that live in their economies, pay more for everything. So there's plenty of economics for everybody without making financial concessions. That's not to say that certain things deserve and need financial concessions to induce the behavior that the world wants to see, or deserved, as simply a matter of kind of bringing the world up to one higher standard. But what I am saying is that there's enough economics so that we don't have to make concessions to our investors or to our issuers at this stage. And we think that that's probably a good thing for scaling this up quickly, because there are commercial incentives in every step of the value chain for people to participate. Third, our approach is completely open source. We're not attempting to make this a JP Morgan product. In fact, from the get-go, our methodology is on the website. When issuers are fine with us publishing the information about their development impact assessments, that goes on our website. It goes into, we're happy for anyone to talk about this, and we're happy and we encourage our peer institutions to adopt a similar kind of methodology. Because at the end of the day, we think that our commercial interests are better served by having a bigger pie that's involved in this, rather than to try vainly to try and keep this to ourselves. And I should also have mentioned that tomorrow, we're kind of working with a couple of other firms, multilateral development banks, including IDB Invest and the sovereign part of the IDB, as well as the World Bank, the IFC, industry associations, and a couple of regulators and standard-setting bodies, as well as third-party opinion providers. We have a meeting tomorrow to try and standardize the JP Morgan methodology, socialize it across the ecosystem. It's not going to look like JP Morgan's methodology anymore, which is good, in order that we could develop this into a more robust asset class. So let me stop there, and if we have any further time, I'm happy to talk about the multilaterals as well.
Thank you very much, Dan and everybody. I think in the interest of time, let's open it up for questions. Let's take, I think we have time, maybe 4 or 5 questions, and then I'll turn it back to our panelists, and maybe each of them can say some concluding remarks, react to what other panelists have said, and also answer the questions, whatever part of the questions they feel it's oriented towards they.
Greetings, terrific program. My name is Raul Herrera, partner at Arnold & Porter, former general counsel at IDB Invest. And in 2017, I was the interim general counsel at GCF in Korea. So my question is, the incoming president of the bank is, and it was before you were there, Dan, you were with Luis Alberto, I was there with Enrique Iglesias. The incoming president of the bank has talked about mobilizing private sector. Prime Minister Motley talked about that. One of the areas that hasn't really been looked at, and perhaps it's because of the separation between the public and the private arms of the institutions, is how do you utilize blended finance as a catalyst to both achieve climate action and satisfying the SDGs? We've got 2030 as an initial target. The G20 in Bali last year endorsed the use of blended finance. President of Indonesia is going to talk about it at the ASEAN meeting, and it's critical for the small developing countries and island countries. I'd be curious to hear how to think out of the box and creatively use blended finance, first loss, lower rates. The incoming president of the bank talked about taking ownership of projects, leading them, and then moving them into private sector, capturing that value add at the outset. Thank you.
Is there any other question? Okay, so we'll take that one and then.
Thank you. Thank you very much to the panelists. Happy to see so many women involved in this critical area of development. I want to follow on from the question asked. And also let me say how pleased I am to hear reference, I think I'm saying it correctly, I heard it from here, that there is an appreciation for the CBD principle, common but differentiated, and that is something that we in the SIDS fought for many years in the negotiations, so it's important that it is happening in the finance sector. I wanted to ask what level of financing you find that you are able to generate for, whether it's blended or not, for small portfolios, like the SIDS and so, because we faced the challenge years ago that, our asks are too small. We are thinking of millions, while the average in JP or in IDB and so is in the billions. Now, because the climatic events are scaling up, we are actually needing now in the billions. But I'm not sure if the institutions are at that level, if there is, not parity, but if there's some sort of equity, a common ground. I come from a small country in the Caribbean, and they're one smaller than us. And so maybe through CARICOM, we can approach IDB or so on. So I want that question, please, because it is very important for us, this question of scale. And I will also benefit from the answer to the question of public-private blending. Thank you.
There was another question on the back.
Hi there. Thank you so much for this amazing panel. I wanted to ask you guys about the increase in the number of climate banks and your thoughts on them. Specifically, do you think that climate banks are a good addition / financing mechanism to increase investment in climate projects, or do you think they dilute the power and from MDBs, and should we be prioritizing, tying climate to investments made by already existing MDBs instead? Thank you.
So let's go over there and then we go back to the panel.
Hi, also very happy to see a lot of women on this panel. I just wanted to ask, especially when you're veering away from the use of proceeds approach towards more like outcome-based, how do private investors sort of digest the long-term nature of some of these outcomes that are also hard to measure? Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, let's do that one and then we.
Hi, thank you. I just have a basic question regarding the merit of basically releasing sustainability-linked bonds. I understand that with normal bonds, you usually do it to project some kind of finance some kind of project, something that will guarantee returns, and you just need an influx of cash at the moment, which hopefully you will be able to pay back in the future. And my question is, how will that happen with sustainability-linked bonds? Because I feel that you're basically making the assumption that becoming more sustainable will guarantee that you will have more funds in the future, which will let you pay back both the interest and the principal. So I'd like to hear more about how that would work.
Thanks. So, we will go for answers and final comments, and we will do it in the reverse order that we had our original presentation. So we start with Dan.
There we go. Thanks very much. Let me start with the blended finance question. So we view the creation of the development finance institution at JP Morgan is itself a blended finance platform. So it's ideally suited to not only distribute securities or other instruments to our kind of commercially minded investors, but it can also very easily accommodate whether it's philanthropic capital or whether it's an MDB to take a tranche of the issuance. And in several of these deals, I think 4 of the 42 that we've done thus far, I think that there have been what are called anchor investments by one or more of the MDBs, which is done essentially to give some reassurance to investors, particularly on debut issuances, that an additional layer of diligence has been done, that an MDB has, kind of carefully thought this through, applied their what are still deemed to be, kind of the top rated ESG standards and the like. So we welcome that. So we think we have a blended finance platform. But let me generalize a little bit further on the whole notion of blended finance. I actually think that our problem is less that we don't have enough blended finance, but more that we don't have enough projects. That the multilaterals currently are ideally suited to initiate projects to help governments design, first of all, identify what their priorities are, to prioritize, to help in design of the projects, to do some of the engineering and other sorts of impact studies that need to be done, or to kind of help their government client owners through that process. The challenge, I think, is not so much laying off risk for the private sector, because there's a price for every risk. The challenge is that the price of that risk still makes sense for the country itself that wants to finance the project. No one would put a super highway in the middle of the Sahara Desert because it wouldn't make sense. The cost of the tolls would be way too high. So there's a similar phenomenon, but yet what we have to be mindful of is that there's certain kinds of investments that will never be commercial, like urban transportation. And so those are the ones that really, deserve blended finance treatment. And it can be done in a whole range of different structures. One, it could be just buying down the interest rate. Another is, a step up, step down, the way Azucena described. A third could just be some layer of first loss. I mean, it depends on what you mean by blended finance. There's all sorts of different structures that are possible, but what you need is industrial scale, and we don't have it right now. That we need kind of the organizations, governments, and those who love them, who work closely with them, to spend a whole lot more of their attention on originating stuff that the private sector would be very happy to finance. That's not the problem. It's the project gap, not the financing gap for financing climate change. Second, on scale, one of the things that we tried to do, and we did it when we were at when I was at the IDB too, is that we work through more localized institutions. So many of the Caribbean countries are not members of the IDB, but in effect they are through the CDB. And so we always had a fairly significant lending program through the CDB to try and reach the island economies that were really too small to justify putting a representative in Washington and all of the rest of it that comes with membership in all of these organizations. I view the same thing as relevant for JP Morgan, is that we need to find local partners through whom we work as a way of reaching economies or clients that are simply not of scale that makes sense, economic sense for us to be working with directly. And that is our approach. Climate banks. I'm not sure I'm quite sure. Do you mean kind of the various climate funds that are being created, or do you mean climate banks at the state level in the United States? I'm not quite sure what you mean. I think that there is something to be said for diluting the world's expertise, but on the other hand, I'm a big believer in 1,000 flowers bloom, so I don't have a strong view on that. Outcomes and outputs and outcomes. It's hard enough to measure the outputs, let alone the outcomes. So I completely agree with the challenges of implied by your question. And I'm sure, kind of when I was at the IDB, we had like 100 people working full time trying to figure out the answers to those questions. We don't have those answers, but what we do have is we have the ability through being an intermediary to work with our clients to publish, to extract data and publish it that seems to make sense for investors, and then let investors decide whether or not it's a meaningful output or whether it's just nonsense. So that's kind of, even once we achieve, say a development impact bond, which is the aim that we're working for at this meeting tomorrow that I mentioned, we're not suggesting to remove the gold star from the issuer who issues gold, development impact bonds, but we are suggesting that transparency will ultimately lead to them not being regarded as a serious issuer. Let me stop there.
Thanks, Dan. Lupin?
Sure. So many questions, great questions. So let me speak first on blended finance. It's needed. There is huge and enormous scope for the private sector to be involved, but it's not a panacea. The reason why I don't think it's a panacea is there are issues in terms of project gaps, technical capacity, but ultimately the question really comes down to who is the final borrower. And the point that PM Motley made, ultimately, if you look at the sums that are needed by the Global South, if they are the ultimate borrower, their debt will not be sustainable, and ultimately asset managers, investors will look for debt sustainability and creditworthiness. So there is that element of the puzzle that really hasn't been talked about in a lot of circles, because we're still stuck on the kind of credit enhancement blended finance question. I think that is needed. We need to solve that. But beyond that, I think the issue really is who is the borrower. When it comes to small nations, in terms of threshold effects, there are clearly threshold effects, and part of it is just the way indices like the ESG and the regular EM indices are built. You need a minimum size of 500 million to be part of the index, and there are other categories, and that kind of catalyzes investors to not only purchase the instrument, but also do additional credit work, research, understand what the longer term challenges are. So, I think that in the bank loan market, you can have smaller sizes and still have allocations to very specialized asset managers, but that threshold effect is something that can be a source of engagement with the benchmark providers. So that's on the kind of small issue, the small new issue size question, and it is an important one. When it comes to just thinking about the challenges related to a lot of the KPIs and the outcomes versus processes and inputs, these are challenges for sure. And as the asset management industry is getting more aware about ESG instruments and essentially using paid subscriptions to third-party providers to help them improve in terms of their technical awareness, I think that it can be resolved to some extent. In terms of the long-term nature of some of these outcomes, you can design instruments which have periodic markers along the life of the instrument. So there are challenges, but there are some solutions. It's not a complete fix, but we can use some tools to try and overcome them.
Thanks, Helen.
Thank you for the questions. Well, in addition to the conversation about blended finance, I think that the point of what we define blended finance is very important. When we talk about blended finance, we refer to using donor resources that we have under management to be able to provide it to specific transaction for a short period of time to resolve a market barrier. Is it a lack of information? Is it a first mover that we're trying to resolve that to make or to demonstrate the case for that technology or that business model? So the blended finance in that regard has a specific role, but there's also an important part, I think, that it's lumped into together, that is the grant resource that has to do with capacity building, with the design of all the studies that Dan was talking about. And the grant resources also come a lot of times from donor resources, or the IDB, the public sector side, has some of their own resources. And it's important for project preparation, because otherwise we continue having that conversation of we want to mobilize a lot of resources and then where are the projects, right? And so that's the issue with blended finance. I think we have to distinguish it between grant and also blended finance that you use it for a small period of time. In terms of the Caribbean, actually we had yesterday a conversation between our president and all the ministers of finance and the PM Mia Mottley, talking about what could we do in the Caribbean? How can we scale the work in the Caribbean? And a lot of it was use existing, for example, institution like the CARICOM Development Fund, but also try to talk about structures that could bring together all the needs of the region. And they were talking about climate change, they were talking about food security, but also private sector investment in transportation. Those were the key issues that came across. But definitely, we do have a role. We see the working with the Caribbean as important, and that's why we have a specific target at IDB Invest to lend 10% of our lending has to go to the Caribbean. And for that, we need a lot of upstream work and a lot of project preparation. Comes back to the point of grant resources, because what we have discovered is that we need to work with regional and local sponsors to get them to the point of having a bankable project, which takes time, but having the goal and having the target, it allows us to focus and have investment officers focus on getting those deals done. In terms of the KPIs, I just wanted to say that it's very important that transparency and seeing what's the result of a lot of these assets is really important. That's why we launched the Green Bond Transparency Platform a couple of years ago, and you can track it. It's an online, it's a public good that private and public sector issuers put there how they're doing with their KPIs, what their achievement is. So you can track in terms not only on the specific timing of the bond, but later on. And to the last point of the sustainability-linked bond, in the conversation that we've had with clients where we offer the idea of the sustainability-linked bond, it's because they want to do more. They have a commitment as a company to decarbonize, or they have a commitment to increase their green procurement. But they also need working capital, for example. And so the way that the sustainability-linked bond works is that it allows you to respond to the short-term need of the company right now of a working capital loan, but with making sure that you have a KPI that it links to the commitment of the company to be net zero, to increase resiliency, or what have you, depending on the context of the corporate. So yes, you're right that it's a long-term view, but if you match the specific needs today with a long-term view, sustainability-linked bonds or loans are the way to go.
Azucena?
Thank you. So maybe I'll start with this last point, the sustainability linked bond, not for the corporates, but for the sovereigns. I think that it's true. The real reason that you issue this kind of bonds is to show your commitment, your true commitment to environmental issues. And the idea is very simple. You don't use those proceeds into something specific that goes to whatever you want to finance your budget, but at the end of the day, in the case of the sovereign, you need to reach certain indicators that are agreed in the Paris Agreement. It is true what you said. It could be the case that you don't reach those objectives and you end in a position that you have to pay more. You're in a bad position, let's say, because you didn't reach your targets, and you have to pay more. And of course, that you have to price that in. You have to be capable of paying that step up in the coupon. But your point is simple, but it's very important. It's true. Then I'm not going to speak about blended finance, but there was this question of how to think out of the box, and I want to once again come with idea to emphasize what Uruguay is working with the World Bank, because we really are sure that this is a very innovative instrument where we can match the need for resources to allocate into environmental issues. I think that the idea of having not only a step-down coupon, it's very important, so that we have positive incentives, and that this will help other countries to move their way into a greener recovery. So this is one of the many points that are within the evolution framework from the World Bank, but we are convinced that this is a very important instrument. I won't say the only one. This is there's not only a unique solutions to these very complex problems, but I do insist our country, our chair, as middle-income countries, as Latin America, we do insist that this is a very convenient way to go, where we ask developed countries to share their responsibility in the emission of greenhouse gases, and they contribute in the step down for the rest of the countries. And let me, as a final comment, react to one of Dan's points, so that we go back to old discussions that we used to have. You said that there is enough economics so that we do not need any concession. So I have some differences there. I think that I would say that in the case of the multilaterals, in the evolution framework from the World Bank, I go back to the point I just mentioned. I think it's important to have this concession, and that the concession comes from developed countries. I think that it's also an opportunity for developed countries to come up with the pledges that they have come up with pledges. Well, now they need to put the money where the mouth is, and they have to put resources there. And when it comes to capital markets, I agree that there is economics, but I think that we are still missing some parts of the economics in that market. Of course, Uruguay issued the sustainability-linked bond. That means that there is economics. There are, however, room to improve. There was this mentioning about how to measure the indicators, and it's true that there are solutions and a lot of progress has been done to measure these key performance indicators, and there are institutions that particularly measure this, validate this, and so on. I think that there is room for the ratings, the rating agencies to incorporate more and more ESG elements into the methodology. I think that there's room for index provider like JP Morgan, that you have come with a MB adjusted by the performance in environmental issues. I think that's very good, and we need more of those indicators. I think that we need to have a broader fiduciary duty in terms that for funds that manage assets. It's not only the coupon that matters. It's not only the return, the direct return. I think that the duty should be broader so that the funds accept a step down and consider that that means that the country is doing well. Going back to your question, if there is a step down, the country is doing well, that means that the quality of that credit is good. That means the price of that bond is better. So I think there's a lot of things that we all have to work together and to finally walk the talk. Thank you.
Thanks. And just taking it from there to wrap up the panel, I think there's a lot of financial engineering, a lot of work on putting together projects, a lot of work of bringing private capital into financing this agenda. And I think that will be a significant push to move this agenda forward, but linking it to the speech by Prime Minister Motley and these words by Azucena and the four panelists here, there's also a significant role to fighting a global challenge where there are huge externalities that have to be played by governments. The Inflation Reduction Act in the US demonstrates the logic in the US that you need sovereign balance sheets to really move this agenda forward. So there will be a significant need to generate this fiscal space in developing and emerging markets together with this financial engineering to attract private capital into this market. So both sides, the financial engineering and the political engineering, will be needed to address this global challenge. And with that, I thank, our four panelists to make a space in their very busy agenda these weeks to be here with us to discuss this issue. Thanks.
Okay, well, thank you very much for staying, and we'll now turn to the second panel, which is going to look more at global trends in ESG, climate change, and energy transition, and also look a bit more specifically about what energy companies and other companies are doing to address and deal with these issues, specifically on Latin America. Let me first introduce our speakers, and being very climate conscious, I have it on my phone, so be patient with me. And I'll start in reverse order. So we have Anna Wellenstein, who is responsible for the World Bank's agricultural, climate, disaster risk management, environment, land, social, urban, and water portfolios in the region, so a lot. And she has over 20 years of experience in urban development and infrastructure, and has led efforts to design and finance investments, facilitate policy reforms, and build capacity in developing countries. Alejandra Vázquez is the VP of Sustainability at Grupo Bimbo. She came all the way from Mexico. We thank her for that. She has over 22 years of experience in Grupo Bimbo, where she has held different positions and reached great achievements. She started her career in food safety, and her professional experience was in the sustainability area. And then second, joining us from Mexico City, there in the screen is Tania Ortiz Mena. She has been president of Mexico for Sempra Infrastructure since November 2021, leading the company's activities related to clean power generation, natural gas, transportation, and fuel storage facilities. She has extensive experience in energy and foreign policy, being a member of the boards on multiple occasions, including the Mexican Natural Gas Association. And from 2015 to 2018, she was a member of the advisory board of Mexico's Energy Regulatory Commission. And then last but not least, my colleague Shari Friedman, who leads Eurasia Group's climate and sustainability practice, focusing on environmental and social policies and trends affecting energy companies, industrial production, retail, supply chains, and financial institutions. And she and the team work across regions and sectors to help clients understand evolving policies and how they will affect clients' businesses today and in the future. So thank you, the four of you, for being here. So let me start with you, Shari. You, well, we sometimes go to the same office, not every day, but you know, from your experience, but also working now, you are able to look at all the global trends in ESG conversations on the policy front, on the development front, but also what companies are doing. So maybe to start with thinking, you can walk us through how you're seeing the recent trends, the recent discussions at the global level, and what you see countries and governments doing, and also, given that we work in a geopolitical analysis firm, how do you see the recent geopolitical events affecting these discussions?
Yeah, oh good, I got it on the first try. Yeah, so there's definitely a lot of trends going on that have a material impact on companies right now, pretty much across all the sectors. And as we start to think about the trends, you can move these into, you can lump these into the climate-specific trends that are affecting companies and the environmental trends that are affecting companies, and then the geopolitical trends that Dan just noted that are also affecting climate opportunities and climate risks. So let's just start with the first one. I think the first major one that we're seeing that has been discussed a lot in the prior session is this move toward decarbonization. And I think that as we think about this, it's very easy to say, you know what, we're not going to make this 1.5 degree target that it's not really a target, but this threshold that the IPCC has identified. And so is decarbonization really a thing? But whether or not we hit where the goal is, we're still seeing policies moving in that direction. As of November, 140 countries had net zero targets. That means trying to get to net zero by an allotted time, and that differs by country. And so these are policies, material policies that are going on the books that are moving toward a direction, whether we make that direction or not. And this, of course, is going to happen differently at different paces, and it's going to look different in different countries. But tracking it is really important for each country. The other trend I would say, and it's interesting, this was noted and again woven into the conversations earlier, is this interconnection between climate and biodiversity and water. Instead of having these as all separate conversations, you're starting to see these melded together. So companies are not saying, you know what, how do I deal with climate? And maybe 10 years down the line, I'll think about biodiversity. Instead, the same ways that you're thinking about it, whether you go forward faster on one than the other, they're all starting to be considered because they're all super interconnected. And they're interconnected on an impact way. Climate affects biodiversity, biodiversity affects water, climate affects water, water affects biodiversity. They're all interconnected. But one of the most important ways that all three of these is interconnected is that they have a material systematic impact on company operations. So no longer are companies trying to solve for avoiding incidents. It's not like you're trying to avoid a spill and that's where your environmental focus is. Instead, companies are needing to understand the systematic impact on their companies from developing business models and developing supply chains that rely on resources that will be very different or perhaps not there in the future. So whether a company is focused on a lot of these changes or not, they're going to affect the company. And so this leads to the next trend that we're seeing that, again, the last panel really highlighted, which was particularly looking at the private sector from JP Morgan having such a focus on it, is this focus from the financial sector on being able to understand these risks. So the financiers are looking to decide whether companies are actually well positioned to thrive in a world where there is going to be a very different access to resources and they're going to have impacts that are very different. Can they thrive in a low carbon world, in a world where countries are moving toward decarbonization, where impacts are happening? And I've filled out, and this is manifesting in disclosures, right? The financial institutions are requiring disclosures, and a lot of times there's mandates. These are regulated, and that was also touched upon in the last panel. But whether it's regulated in your country or not, it's still a material to a lot of the companies because it affects access to capital when you're dealing with international markets. And I filled out, when I used to work at the IFC before I was at Eurasia Group, I was in charge of doing the TCFD, which was the climate level disclosure. And what I found interesting is everybody thinks about it in terms of risk, right? Are you limiting your risk? But most of it, I argue that 3/4 of it was about opportunity. Are you identifying the right opportunities to position your company? Because if you mitigate for your downsides, that's great. But if you're not looking for your opportunities and your upsides, you're going to lose in the competitive market. So it's a very interesting perspective from an investor perspective. And I think the last one that I would say on the specific environmentally focused trends is this trend toward incorporating climate right now and probably later biodiversity into trade. And this is, again, like, it's kind of danced on the margins of trade here and there over the years, but this is a whole different story. And we're seeing it most clearly and impactfully right now in Europe, where Europe has a price on carbon through their emissions trading, and a subsector of that for their trade-intensive sectors, energy-intensive, trade-exposed sectors, are covered under something called their Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, their CBAM. What this means is that if you have an export to Europe on one of these materials, one of these materials like iron and steel or aluminum or chemical fertilizers, if you're importing into Europe and you don't have a commensurate carbon price on your manufacturing, you will have to pay at the border. This means that even if your country doesn't have a policy that is moving you toward decarbonization in some of these energy intensive sectors, but you're exporting your major export partner into the EU, you still have to pay attention to what your carbon intensity is. It's like the EU is exporting its environmental regulations in a way. And then we can look at, as you noted, Dan, there's also geopolitical trends that have an impact on some of the risks and opportunities. And there's a lot of them, but the one that I would highlight right now that's, I think, particularly relevant to companies and investors in Latin America is this decoupling between this US and China decoupling. So as the US and China are decoupling, the US is trying to build its supply chain in, what it considers friendly countries. This can happen at pace. The US, I think, perceives itself to have some time. However, if China starts to get more involved in the Russian invasion of Ukraine, supporting Russia, you might see this accelerated. And if it accelerates, there's going to be a much bigger push to start to look for supply chains for some of the decarbonization opportunities in non-China countries, in friends. It's the friendshoring. I think that you'll see this opportunity through a lot of different sectors. You probably see it in critical minerals. I think that was mentioned earlier. In critical mineral processing, a lot of times we just think about the extraction, but there's processing that goes on as well, which sometimes is the higher value add. So these are each trends that companies need to be looking at, and I know that the rest of the panel is probably going to identify the so what. So so what are the opportunities? So what are the risks? And I'll leave it there and pass it on to the other panelists to dive a little bit more deeply.
Thank you very much, Sherry. So jumping to the other extreme of the stage, Anna. So within these global trends, what are you seeing more specifically in Latin America? What are you seeing governments doing? Are you seeing them aligned or not? And also, how is this affecting or impacting the way the bank thinks about its own role?
Right, there you go. Thank you. So no, thank you, and thank you, Sherry, for the great kickoff, because there are so many parallels really on the government side to what you said. So first, I think most importantly, the thing we're talking about with government, some see it, some don't, is that climate change, the forces of climate change, the greening of the global economy is really an opportunity for Latin America. So the idea that Latin America has somehow forced to invest in adaptation, they already have to do it because they're greatly impacted. Mia Motley was here first this morning, and I'm sure she talked about the impacts in her country, no? And Minister Avalecha could talk about it as well in Uruguay. So those impacts are there. They're nothing to be avoided. They're nothing that as the global north we're going to force. They're already dealing with it. And those are smart investments in resilience with what they have today. So we have studies that say always $1 invested in resilient infrastructure to make it more adaptable to climate change has $4 in return, so a 1-to-4 ratio. Not only that, but the region really has this opportunity on decarbonizing. So we have a very clean energy matrix that make it easy as a spring off point. We have an urbanized region with dense cities that makes it easier to do things like convert to public transport, electrify transport. We have vast mineral resources that are really needed for the climate transition in the world. If we can move more and more towards climate smart agriculture and sustainable forestry, those are huge markets, no? And so if we can move to climate smart agriculture, we really access those very lucrative European markets and other very green markets. So I think the first message for what we're talking to countries about is this is a real opportunity. And some are seeing it, some are getting there, no? So it always varies. There's a lot of commitment to the climate change issues in LAC. I think you have almost all the countries with NDCs submitted to the UNFCCC. Many are committed to net zero by 2050. 7 of them already have long-term strategies laid out with timelines and dates and targets for getting to that number, or that net zero. And I don't think that's common across all regions in the world. So that is happening. In our own studies, we're seeing things like, for example, in Peru, when we've looked at climate change and done some thorough assessments, climate change and development together, given their clean energy matrix, given their fertile lands, their copper resources, if they can control deforestation, manage their water resources, decarbonize transport as they grow and urbanize more, and really lean into sustainable agriculture and copper, our assessments are that they increase GDP 2% by 2030, which is a lot given the LAC region's sense of growth, and 10% by 2050. So these are the messages we're really working with governments. Some really see it. I think Uruguay is a really good example. So it's a country early on that's recognized that our future is very linked to our natural resources. That's not something that many countries would have said in the past. How we sustainably use those resources matters. And I think that's changing how governments are acting. So you see places like Uruguay do it as part of their economic planning, do some of their analysis of it. When they submitted their NDCs, we worked with them to look at what are the measures in your NDCs and which are the best ones for your economy. They worked it into their financing, as you heard, and they work it into their sector strategies. And I think those are all really important options that we're seeing. So I think Costa Rica is another great example. Drawing a little bit on, Sherry, what you said more, so this idea of CBAM and what the impacts of the European markets and other lucrative markets, it's a real thing, no? And so a lot of the work that we're doing these days in agriculture is around, really getting climate smart and resource sustainable agriculture happening, making sure that there's systems in place to monitor and verify and track so that they can access these markets. So that's a bit the name of the game today, is how we can do it climate smart and then verify so the markets can actually get to it and know in a way that's efficient. I think in terms of, you mentioned the financial sector and being able to know, another big area where we're seeing governments super interested is the taxonomies for the financial sector, where they have a measure and indicators on the sustainability of all the things that they're financing and a way to monitor so that it can be transparent to the markets. We're even seeing central banks, and in some countries are leaning in. The Central Bank of Brazil the last few years has been really leaning into the whole idea of how do we look at the impacts of biodiversity on the sustainability and robustness of our financial sector. So it's a bit of a change for me from years ago to the first person knocking on my door in a country about biodiversity is the central bank. So they're great. They're great partners and super innovative and creative. So I think a lot of this is happening on the government side, not uniformly. A lot of it takes capacity. What we're finding, it's not just about developing projects, but it's really about helping governments develop systems to know, to plan, to track, to have data, to really sort of mainstream that whole thinking on climate and sustainability throughout their economy. I think that's the critical next step to really getting the changes to scale and getting finance to scale. Thanks.
Very much. So now turning to the screen, Tanya, hopefully you can hear us. And so you're at the forefront of the energy transition in many ways, at least in North America. So I was wondering if you can help us understand what you're seeing are the main trends in terms of the energy transition, and how far are you really seeing this advancing in the US, in Mexico, and in Latin America?
Thank you, Daniel. Can you hear me well? Okay, well, good afternoon to everyone. I'm sorry I couldn't join in person. But first, thank you, Shari and Anna, for providing such a thorough context on what is happening globally with climate change and energy transition, and particularly in Latin America. And I think Shari made a very important point. Net zero 2050 is aspirational. So should we've been trying to move in that direction. But then I think both Shari and Anna pointed to very specific drivers, which make, I think, all of us believe that we definitely should continue moving in that direction, whether 2050 net zero is achievable or not. So let me talk about Mexico in particular and what the specific drivers are for energy transition in particular, which I think are much more important than maybe the longer term aspirations. And I think, all of Latin America, but Mexico in particular, which is what I know best, have very strong drivers in place. to move towards the energy transition. First, obviously, the macro driver, the Mexican economy, a very large economy, very dynamic economy, but very importantly, it's an economy that depends on exports. It's one of the countries that has the largest number of free trade agreements. We're now, for people that think about Mexico as an oil-producing country, that's not who we are anymore. We're a manufacturing country, we're an exporting country, and we have a very unique opportunity to capture what we now call friendshoring, ally-shoring, nearshoring. Mexico is, of course, ideally positioned with its proximity to the United States, free trade agreement in place, but also, or let's call it, the way our economy complements the needs of the U.S. economy. But what's missing in this picture is the availability of cleaner energy to be able to really take full advantage of this opportunity. So today, Mexico's public policy has been mainly focused on the state versus private discussion, what the role of the state should be in the energy sector versus private participation. But these very fundamental drivers of all of our investors, existing and future investors, Mexican companies and foreign companies, requiring clean, reliable, and affordable energy in order to be able to continue investing in Mexico and growing investment in Mexico. So that's creating a very, very positive momentum. And if you combine it with, let's call it the fundamentals of our energy resources, first, Mexico, it has very rich solar and wind resources in every aspect, because as you all know, it's not just a matter of having a lot of wind and a lot of sun, but having very large portions of land, where it's located, how land is used for other purposes. So we're very, very rich in renewable resources. And in addition, we also have access to an energy source that I think we all acknowledge is critical for the energy transition, which is natural gas. I think the war in Ukraine has led us to look again natural gas and the relevance of natural gas in the energy transition, in the, let's call it, the relevance of energy security in the discussion around energy transition. So Mexico also has access to cheap and abundant gas from the United States. So fundamentally, Mexico is in a great place to move forward its energy transition. I think international development banks have a key role in making that happen, in ensuring that Mexico's long-term energy policies are pointing in that direction. But again, I would say, even though at the moment the discussion again is more about public versus private, the fundamentals are so strong that Mexico has a critical role to play as a leader in Latin America's energy transition.
Excellent. Thank you, Tania, very much. And so now let me turn it to you, to Alejandra. So you work for Grupo Bimbo, and I think it's interesting because you are, a global company, but also a Latin American company that produces, a lot of things, but especially food. And so I think the interesting thing is, how are you incorporating all these trends and all these demands and the concerns into your own operations and into the challenges of being a Latin American company, a global company as well? And also, does it matter that you're a Latin American company or not?
Thank you. So, in behalf of Grupo Bimbo, I want to say first, thank you for the invitation. I'm really happy to be here with all these experts to discussing these interesting things. Thank you, Daniel and Alejandro, for the invitation. First of all, I'm going to step back a little bit, because I don't know if somebody here doesn't know about Grupo Bimbo, but I'm going to explain what is Grupo Bimbo. Then I can explain the actions we are taking in terms of climate change. So Grupo Bimbo is the largest baking company around the world. We have more than 200 bakeries around the world in 34 countries and in 4 continents. Working with us as associates, we have more than 140,000 associates in the company. So thinking of that, our main purpose as a company is nourishing a better world. We think how we're going to do that, nourishing a better world. So we think that we can do it in a pretty holistic way in 3 main action lines. One is Bake for You. That means all about nutrients, how we're going to have better recipes with less ingredients and nutrition in every bite. The second action line is Bake for Life, that it's all about the communities, how we work in the communities where we operate, but also in the communities around the value chain to improve the lives of the communities. And the third one is Bake for Nature. It's all about how we are going to regenerate, all about the impacts in terms of carbon, water, agriculture, and also all about waste. So thinking in this pretty holistic approach, and when you ask to us about the trends, for us it's not like a new trend in terms of sustainability. We have been working in sustainability since the beginning, where our philosophy to be a highly productive and deeply humane company. In the time, we include a lot of best practices in terms of environment, or how we improve our behavior in terms of environment. But it's really interesting that knowing that we are the biggest baking company, we also have responsibilities. So that's why we increase the level of ambition in the company with public commitments in terms of all these 3 things I already explained. I'm gonna give you some examples of that, and my colleagues already talk about this trend in terms of defining our net zero carbon emissions for in 2050. For sure, to reach that, we need to have a roadmap across the time to define that. For example, we have to reach 100% of all the electrical energy we receive from renewable energies in 2025. The last year we closed with 85 around all the operations. So we are working a lot in this roadmap to reaching the 2050 net zero carbon emissions. But also we have another big challenge, agriculture. We really believe that the food industry is part of the solution of the food security. So one of our key elements in terms of our actions is going to be we need to receive, or we want to receive in 2050, all our key ingredients for regenerative practices. So we are working a lot in this key element because we know that we have to be part of the food security issues. So that's another of the things that we're working on. So if you can see, we are incorporating new and ambitious goals, pretty clear goals, to work in all of these challenges that we have as a company.
Thank you very much. So I have a few follow-up questions before I turn it to the audience. So let me start with you, Tanya, in the screen. I think it's a similar question for the 4 of you. Maybe I changed it a bit. So as you start following up on what you described, and I think one interesting thing of what you said is that particularly in Mexico, it's really a North American story, right? So I guess my question is, what do you think, or what would you be expecting governments, or what do you think governments and companies should do more? And specifically, I think, the governments in North America.
Thank you, Daniel. That's a very interesting question. And when you think about North America as a whole, I think an important reflection is that, yes, I mean, North America is clearly an economic bloc. It's an integrated region. 5 years ago, there was a discussion as to whether USMCA or the North American Free Trade Agreement should continue to exist or not. But the integration is so strong that it's a reality. But that the question, what is going on in the energy front? Are we an integrated region? And no, we're not. We act as islands, the US, Mexico, and Canada. So there's so much work to be done in thinking regionally as an integrated energy system, where, for example, the United States is a great producer of natural gas, but Mexico can not only expand its renewable generation production, but we can actually become an exporter of clean energy into the United States. So just establishing the basis for that collaboration, it's actually surprising that we're not having those discussions on the energy front, because we're having it on every other economic front. So I think that's one key discussion. Another key discussion, again, is the role of private and public sector. In the energy sector in particular, it's impossible to have a strong and resilient system without the collaboration between both private and public sector. And of course, it's a critical role for the finance sector, in particularly development banks, to play. So having everybody at the table and having that discussion is critical. And I would say in energy in particular, as is the case with, in general, with investments in infrastructure that are very capital in very intensive in capital, regulatory and legal stability and certainty are critical. And I'm not only referring to Mexico, but also to the United States and Canada. You know, we need to take very, very long-term views in order to be actually able to foster this public-private collaboration. And then, I mean, without, going too much into technicalities, I think that the one discussion that needs to be at the top of everyone's mind as we think about energy transition is power transmission. Everybody thinking about where we build more solar plants and wind farms, and whether it's wind offshore, who is taking care of transmission. If we don't strengthen our transmission lines, I think our energy transition is going to fail. I think, in fact, it was the front page of The Economist this week that had a transmission tower on its front page. So ensuring that we have the appropriate investment in transmission, that's in many occasions, it's in the hands of governments or monopolistic utilities. I think it's critical, and that's another, I think, road where development banks have a critical role to play. So there's so much collaboration between countries, between public and private sectors, and thinking about our systems as regional systems rather than as isolated systems.
Thank you very much. So, Alejandra, turning to you. So, you described, a lot of the things you're doing. So, if you had to think of the main challenge to this, but also the things that you would expect governments to help with, and obviously that I'm sure there's differences between countries, but which one would that be?
Well, I'm gonna say two, not only one. Two. It's really interesting to see that for sure we have different level between the countries where we operate. So one of the key challenges that we have as a company is maintain the pace for reach these goals in all the countries where we operate. So this is really important for us, looking for the technology available to reduce the use of resources, energy, water, and all of these things. So in the same pace in all the countries with different realities. So this is a really challenge that we have in the operational side. But also, there is, I guess, one biggest challenge that we have that, and also the Prime Minister talked about that in terms of we have to have the shared purpose between or among all the stakeholders. It's super important that all of us understand that we have to do something in these topics, and everybody has to do something in this. For example, inside of the company, we always say that our purpose is nourishing a better world. So everybody inside the company knows that work to reach that purpose. So it doesn't matter the area where you are. You need to work in your area to help us to reach that purpose. So that's the way we need the challenge we need to face. Everybody, all the stakeholders need to have a shared purpose to understand what we are going to do in all of these challenges. No?
Thank you for that. So Anna, maybe following up on that, from your role when you're seeing the region, what do you think is first the main challenge for advancing this agenda on governments, but also if you were to think what would they do, but also what private companies should or could be doing more, what would it be?
It's a good question. No one asks me usually what private companies should be. No, I'm always on the other side of the fence. But I think in terms of what governments should do or could do, I think it's this deeper understanding, and it's not as if they should, but what would be the next steps, no? So I take away the sort of scolding aspect of should, but more what's the next opportunity? I think it's really deepening this understanding of what a changing climate means to their economy and their people. And I think we're often sort of operating off partial knowledge. And when you gain that deeper understanding of what it means for the economic opportunities, the impacts that are going to affect the lives of their people, then the policy decisions and the public investment decisions come a little bit more cleanly. And that's not an easy thing to do. It's data intensive, it's high analytics, but I think it can be super impactful when you can put numbers out in front of a government and help them make decisions and then help them communicate to their people. And I love the fact that, Alejandro, you brought that up at the end, this idea of a shared goal among your company. It's the same thing with societies and with countries in Latin America. And as you were speaking, I was thinking of some of the attempts in the last few years in the region to do certain reforms that have met with a huge degree of backlash. They weren't all bad reforms. One, they weren't part of a package that looked at all the implications of what they were doing. So they might have had one reform that made sense. Let's say you're going to pull a subsidy from a fossil fuel that's really not efficient, that's broadly used to all income segments. That's not a bad thing. I would advise most governments to do that, but you need to make sure you protect poor people, and you need to make sure that it's really well explained to your society. So I think this idea of understanding, shared understanding, and communicating and bringing in support from the population is critical, especially given sort of the volatility that we've seen in the region over the last year. So I think that's really fundamental. So I think in addition to deepening this understanding of what their economy and societies look like in a changing climate, bringing in people into that knowledge, I think then they have to build it into their planning frameworks. So what are the smart investments that you can make in the short term? I think those are really critical. You can build them into your financing frameworks, as we heard from Uruguay. Chile is also doing a great job of building into their financing frameworks. And then really to have this whole line about protecting people. And I think we talk about just transition a lot in the context of the energy sector. In Latin America, it's important to remember, different from almost any other region of the world, 47% of the emissions in Latin America come from agriculture, land use change, and forestry. The only other region that's sort of close to that is Africa, and that's just because they haven't urbanized yet. As they urbanize, that's going away. But in Latin America, that's really a huge part of what's happening in the region. The energy sector emissions are like 42, 43, and those are concentrated in certain countries. And so I think thinking about what's a just transition in the rural sector is a really important framework for the region. Thank you.
So Sherry, turning to you and following up on that, maybe from a more global perspective, three questions. One is, when you think about Latin America and other regions, like, do you see any difference in terms of the countries or how they're dealing with this? And the second one, and I often are in panels and I hate when people ask this question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. How do you see the role of the U.S. on this, on the U.S. government? Obviously, it's important for this administration, but in terms of the global regulation, but also specifically in Latin America.
So, getting to the first question and the difference between different countries, I mean, and sort of riding also on this question that you had about what should countries be doing and what are countries doing, you're seeing this decarbonization and kind of moving over toward decoupling your economy from carbon really looks different in different countries. There is, when we talk about these general trends that we're seeing, they are very broad. But when you look at every country is doing it at a different pace, and that's based on a lot of different factors. It's based on, is your constituency bought in? I mean, the people who are making these decisions are the people who are going to be out of office in 4 years, so they don't have a whole lot of time to get people behind them. So you have constituency buy-in. Do you have the resources to be able to do this? What are your domestic industries look like? So when you look at, an oil producing country and you look at a country that has critical minerals, what they're going to be doing is going to look super different. So I would say, first of all, there are a lot of differences. And again, wrapping back around to, what should countries be looking at, I think that one of the things that and Prime Minister Motley had noted this, that what we're about to see, I don't think is fully understood. And so when we look at the way that countries are structuring their policies, I think it's very tempting to think that we're going to be on this gradual movement over toward what we're eventually going to see as a decarbonization policy. And I think that countries and companies need to be prepared that there may be much more abrupt movements than we're anticipating. And the reason that there's going to be much more abrupt movements is that there's going to be impacts that are facilitating people getting more angry about what they're not going to be able to have, or companies having material impacts on their bottom line. So I'll just take climate, for example, because that's the one I've been in for the longest time. I started working on climate in the mid-1990s, pre-Kyoto Protocol. So this was like a very, very long time ago. And there has been a lot of nothing going on for a really long time, right? There was, a lot of talk, a lot of movement, a lot of people thinking, knitting their eyebrows and going, we're going to change, but nothing happening. All of a sudden, I would say in the last 7 years, the pace that countries have been moving has been very fast. Admittedly, from the environmental point of view and the point of view of trying to meet goals, not fast enough. I think that point has been made, and the science backs it up, that the movement so far and the actions that governments have made are not sufficient in order to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. However, it's been really fast. And what I've noticed is that there's things that have made these jumps that are really unpredictable, right? There's things that have suddenly made everybody pay attention. The IPCC report, right, that came in and that claimed net zero. When that came out, people were like, are you kidding me? Net zero by 2050? That's insane. But little by little, people started to understand it and started to move on it, right? And then you had Greta Thunberg, right? Greta Thunberg comes out, like nobody expected her, but she mobilized a whole generation by going, hello, we're about to all die if we don't deal with this. And then another one, which is, maybe less dramatic, but I think super dramatic, and anybody here in the financial sector will think is super dramatic, and I'm sure those of you who have to deal with financial sector would too, which is this idea of material risk and underlying risk that Mark Carney came on when he was the head of this Financial Stability Board. Like, that was transformational. Nobody was thinking of that. So the point that I'm making, and this is true on both climate and on biodiversity, is that what we're seeing right now, there's probably, given the environmental pressures that we're about to see, going to be some more shifts that we can't really expect. So when I think about what countries should be doing and what they should be looking at, what companies should be looking at, it's kind of expect some more shifts that I can't predict. I just anticipate that they are going to be coming. And then the role of the US government. I mean, the US government is just a big player. And what we saw, this kind of gets to what different countries are doing. The US government's in a position where there's not a lot of buy-in, constituent buy-in to do a whole lot, right? There's not a lot of buy-in to do a carbon tax or to do a lot of regulatory, command and control action. But the US has a lot of financial resources. So basically, provided through the IRA a lot of financial resources and incentives, and that's what the United States did to build its own domestic green economy. It's basically it's an industrial policy. One of my colleagues who works on the US calls it an industrial policy in a Greenpeace t-shirt. I think that's a really great way to describe it. So the impact of that is that, I'm sure that people have seen that other countries are getting annoyed that the United States has put so much money toward it, but now other countries are starting to put a lot of money toward it, and other countries are also starting to position themselves to be able to fill in the gap where the United States may not be able to move as rapidly. And this sort of gets to the critical minerals point. And it gets to some other areas where, you said, and what's the impact on Latin America? I think the impact on Latin America is going to be, as the United States starts to build its own domestic industry, as it's decoupling from China, is where are the opportunities there to be able to provide the green services, that whatever it is that the United States need to move its green economy along faster without having to rely on China, is going to be where a lot of the opportunities are.
So, well, I could keep asking questions, but maybe we should take some questions from the audience. So there's one here, one there, one there. Yeah, maybe we should take all of them.
Put them up again, sorry. Put your hand up again, sorry. Start here and go back.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you all for taking the time today. My name is Danny Nace. I work for the Department of Energy. One of the questions that I struggle with in looking at the region on energy and climate trends is the mismatch in incentive structures that we've talked about with, you have a 4-year presidential cycle in most countries, 6 in some, but we have 2050 goals. We have 2030 methane pledges that you can pledge to and say, my successor will handle that probably, but it sounds good. How does the region, and really, I mean, this is a global question, and it affects the US too, if another administration of another party comes into power in 2024, how that would affect the IRA playing out. But for the Latin American region, how does every country in the region grapple with those incentive structures, and how do we as financial institutions, as multilateral banks, kind of push through those mismatched timelines to make that substantive change, to actually make progress towards these kind of nebulous pie in the sky goals?
Thank you very much, and thanks for the seminar as it winds down. Somebody spoke about shared purpose, and I am shocked really, and that's why I stayed so long, that there could be any questioning of the 1.5 degrees Celsius target. It is not only written into the Paris Agreement, but it is in that famous document that Mr. Obama wanted to adopt, which is the Copenhagen Accord. So there should, and it's in the IPCC work, there should be no wiggling around 1.5 degrees. And I have observed that there's a sort of movement back to 2 degrees. I don't know if it's a way to cope with the advancing of the net zero targets, It is our globally agreed to, a target of 1.5. And it matters. It really does matter. I think IPCC has also done a study on the difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees. And so we should continue to aim for that. Secondly, I want to say that we all have big work to do. And again, in the Caribbean, which I know best, and of course all the SIDS and others, that there is a commitment on decarbonization and the energy grid transition and so on. But I think that the deficit there may be universal, is in the first instance, education. Is not enough of widespread societal knowledge. The knowledge is still in professional spaces. That's not going to get us there fast enough. So we need to do more education. And we are in a university, so this might be some homework, if there's a dean in here, to figure out how to get wider education around the targets and so for that. And then I think secondly, the financing. The appropriate kinds of financing. I talked about scale earlier on and really spoke about the blending, but the public finance still has to be there. The responsibility for CBD, for common but differentiated, and the climate justice agenda has to be part of the mainstreaming of the climate finance work. Lastly, I also endorse the call to protect the vulnerable. But to protect the vulnerable is not just safety nets and all of those traditional things. It really is to bring them into the lead in transformation so that the SDGs are fulfilled, leave no one behind in the climate drama as well. And I want to thank the lady about the corporation. I don't know it, and I'd like to find out more about baking your way through. Is it bake, you say, or bank? I don't know what your company. Baking? Yeah. Well, this is exciting. So I will see you afterwards. Thank you.
Hi, thank you to all panelists for coming here today. I have a question, or kind of directed towards Alejandra as well. I recently learned about a chocolate processing company in the US called Blommer. Their main problem is being able to market their sustainable products towards their customers, which are mostly businesses also including baking companies like Grupo Bimbo. Yeah, and so I was wondering if you had any examples of maybe some of these suppliers that successfully pitched their sustainable products to you. What kind of messages resonated the most, and what sold you in the end?
Answer them or yeah, maybe let's. Okay, go ahead.
Let's talk about the community part, and the first question is, well, in our Bake for Life initiative, we are working in different ways with the community. In the communities around our facilities, in a program that we call Good Neighbor, that means that we work in the community to develop different things. It depends on the country. For example, some things of education, some things of how we improve the community itself in terms of infrastructure, different programs to improve the community. This is a program around our facilities. The other big program around our value chain is the Regenerative Agriculture Project. Here we're working with the farmers to develop a set of best practices to reduce the impact in environmental issues, reduce the use of chemicals, reduce the use of water, improve a lot of things in terms of use of fuels, and that helps us to reduce or capture carbon and improve the soil health. So in that way, we try to work with the farmers to launch or to use these best practices around all the fabrication, all the sourcing. And well, the idea is to have it in all of our key ingredients. Now we closed the last year with 86,000 hectares of these practices in wheat. And we are working mainly in US and Mexico in these kind of practices because it's the beginning. And this is a way we try to improve the lives of the communities, but also with a deeper purpose to maintain across the time all the soil health. So this is also one of the examples that we are working with the supply chain to give you a better product at the end of in the shelf life. So you can find different products like that. We're working with the regenerative agriculture practices, but also we are working to improve with positive nutrition our products with whole grains, with fruit, with nuts, to improve the nutrition inside the product. So you can find different solutions, but the idea is that all of our products and comes or produce with these kind of practices.
Tanya, Sherry, Anna, do you guys want to add anything to the questions?
I'm happy to jump in a little bit, if you don't mind. So thank you. So just a little bit in response to how do we deal with the long-term business? I think, Dan, you asked that, and I think it's a super important question. A lot of countries in the region do have NDCs before the UNFCCC that gives their plan for the next 5 years. I think that's important. It's part of their planning. 7 countries in the region, as I mentioned, have long-term strategies, which is really good. So not only do they say, I'm going to hit net zero by 2050, but here's when I'm going to do it, here's when I'm going to do it, and here are my benchmarks. So at least it's a bit more foresight and thought in how they're getting there. But I think we go beyond that. So when we're talking to governments, it's not only that it's long-term, but it's just the level of uncertainty, I think, makes realistically, not only for them to have the tenacity to make the decision, but what is the right decision? No, technologies are changing. When global markets are going to change, are the Europeans going to not want their dirty, products next year, or is it in 5 years, or is the U.S. going to pass trade regulations? So I think dealing with that uncertainty is really, truthfully, difficult for governments and decision makers. So one of the things we talk about a lot is decision making under uncertainty when we look at policy options with government. And so instead of looking at normally one pathway like we do, we look at thousands of pathways. And then we advise the governments, avoid the lock-in things. So don't invest in something where there's a chance that in 10 years it's completely obsolete. So just stay away from those things and then take the no-brainer solutions. And I've seen it play out in different kinds of scenarios for governments. Sometimes when there are very difficult decisions to be made, like when you're an island in the Pacific and probably you're going to go underwater, you might not want to start out that discussion with your constituencies now, 30 years before, but you're going to begin to take steps that, protect the people in the next few years, those obvious investments, and then work your way towards things that are bigger and when they're more urgent. In terms of the shared agenda, I love it. You get another call out from me. I think it's super important for what we do. I agree with it, and I do believe that people know about climate change and what it does for them. I think they feel it and they experience it, all kinds of people, but they might not articulate it in the same ways that we all would talk about climate change. They use different words, but it's out there, and I think when you have conversations with people that are being impacted, it's really obvious to them. So I think it's understood, but maybe not with as much depth in terms of what to do about it. And I think that's where we can come in and really have a dialogue. I think empowering people that are vulnerable, both in urban and rural areas, is really critical to understanding what's happening and empowering them to make decisions. Just a little bit of data. We've done studies or seen studies in Brazil where in places where we've actually have strong tenure rights for indigenous populations, the deforestation rates go way down. And so just an idea that if you empower some of the people that are most impacted by climate change, they actually are really good stewards in helping us deal with it. So thank you.
Go ahead, Tanya. You want to say something?
Thank you. That's just from the, I mean, fully agree with everything that Anna pointed out, but from the public sector perspective, I think the public sector has a key role to play in ensuring that the governments are pointing in the right direction. Because for private companies, it's a fact that where investors are demanding clear climate change strategy, it's clear that the banks are demanding clear climate change strategies. It's clear that our customers are demanding climate change strategies, even our employees in some cases. So I think because the private sector has very clear drivers to move in that direction, they have a very proactive, or they should be playing a very proactive role in working with their governments and finding, like Anna said, the no-brainers. In Latin America in particular, which is the area that I'm familiar with, there are so many opportunities that are just win-win. It's not about subsidizing. It's not about, I mean, carrot and sticks, which is the debate that's going on between the US and carrots and Europe the sticks. I think there are a lot of opportunities that can be captured that are net positive. Now, sometimes for the developing world, it seems like a little bit overwhelming, those 2050 net zero targets. But I think that if the private sector, together with global development banks, sit together with the governments and point out those opportunities that are win-win for the communities, for, I mean, their longer term climate change strategy, there is a path forward, but that's yet to be done. And again, it appears to be overwhelming. And I think that we, I mean, private sector need to work with our governments in order to create this sense of opportunity. I mean, I love what Shari said about, is this a challenge or is this an opportunity? And I think in Latin America in particular, it's a great opportunity, but we want to make sure that our countries understand that. And particularly, obviously, the oil producing countries that fear that they're going to essentially lose their momentum and the engines of their economy. So I think there's a lot of work to be done, but the opportunities are there.
Hello? Okay, we're just going to say a couple of comments.
Just a couple of things. I think I won't reiterate on the 2030 goals. I thought, Anna, you covered that. I think you covered the community. And Tanya, I want to build on a little bit what you said about the companies moving on policy. I mean, because actually to get to the question, the woman just left, but she had a question on climate finance. And to me, climate finance ends up coming down to policy, because you can have all the disclosures that you want, but if you're disclosing climate risk and you're in a country or you're perceiving that there's really going to be no movement or really no financial ramifications for doing something that's very carbon intensive, the disclosure doesn't matter. You're just disclosing that there's no risk. You're saying, yeah, we evaluated it and there's no risk. So it really ends up coming down to the policy. And this is where, like you guys were talking about, the companies saying, look, we kind of want some certainty here. You know, like, we don't want to know that all of a sudden you're going to come down with a boom in 5 years. We want to know, like, what's the plan here? So I think that's where, I think that's a really important piece around the financing. And I also want to get to this point on 1.5 degrees. Again, the woman who had noted this had left. But this is not a political target. This isn't like, you know what, if we don't make it this year, yeah, it's 2050, we're going to try to limit it to 1.5. This is like this is the Paris alignment target. It's not. This is a scientific threshold. And if you exceed it, there are just physical ramifications that it doesn't matter what I think or what you think or what anybody thinks. It's what the scientists are telling us is going to happen. So the political rallying around that target is really only around a physical limit. And then if it looks like that there is no will and that governments are not going there, then everybody has to shift their balance between how much they're going to mitigate and how much they're going to adapt, because then suddenly your adaptation costs, which get to your point of the 1-to-4 ratio, are far higher. So those are.
Hi. I'm from Anglo American, the diversified mining company. And often when we have a conversation about climate change and ESG, it's often led by the E part. And sometimes the S seems to lag behind. Now, just, my context is the South African context. And often you can't have a conversation about climate change, about impacts on the environment without the social leading the conversation, just given the nature of inequality and so on. I guess the question that I have within the Latin American context is, given the fact that there are a lot of opportunities, but some risks that come with the transitioning currently happening on the continent. What are the finance mechanisms that are available, especially for some of those social implications? So I think the lady there had mentioned things like reskilling, adaptation, jobs, and so on. Thanks.
Hi, thank you so much for coming. I'm a student in the undergrad at the SFS here. As we all know, coastal and island nations are slowly going underwater, and many countries in Southeast Asia are leading the way, and Indonesia is moving its capital to more inland, but they also have a much higher population and more manpower. How can we empower Caribbean countries who often have sparser populations and less political power to be more present in investors' minds and just have them in mind when we're thinking about coastal and island nations?
Yeah, Chris Garman, also at the Eurasia Group. But just a question a little bit more broadly to the panel, getting the hook of the conversation thread that we've seen over the past hour, which I think is the notion of risks versus opportunities. And I think that the point has been very eloquently made on the panel that Latin America has tremendous opportunities with these energy and climate challenges. I guess my question is, to the extent that all of you are on the front lines, do you see the pivot in policymakers seeing this as an opportunity on the one hand, and the private sector as well? I think the case has been made that it's there, but the speed at which that political calculus is made will then directly impact some of the bottlenecks that were discussed even in the previous panel of lack of projects or lack of instruments and so on and so forth. Are you guys seeing this transition, both in the public sector as well as the private sector?
Do you want another one or no? No. Oh, she is. Yeah.
Thank you, everyone. Fascinating discussion. A very brief question that is maybe very complex, but what do you think the role of natural gas is and should be? It's clear that emissions from agriculture are number one in the region, but as you have mentioned, these countries, Latin American countries, are rising as manufacturing countries, so natural gas is going to play a key role in energizing these emission-intensive, trade-exposed industries. Is there a carbon budget for the region to feed all this natural gas? Should we be thinking about diversifying away from natural gas? Thank you so much again.
Yeah, go, Tanya. I think Tanya. Yeah, you want to go?
Let me try to tackle the hard one, natural gas, what the role of natural gas should be. I think natural gas has a fundamental role to play in the energy transition as renewable energy resources. Now, unfortunately, they have become very competitive. Technologies are now competitive with power generated with natural gas, but there are still limits to what renewables can do in terms of intermittency, in terms of location. So natural gas continues to play a critical role, and I think it became very evident again with the situation in Europe and the reliance of Europe in Russian natural gas. The question is how we phase out that natural gas. And it's not a short-term solution, but we should be thinking about phasing out natural gas. First, I think in resolving the intermittency with renewables, meaning as we're able to develop larger scale batteries, that means that a solar plant is not only producing during the daytime, but that I can actually store that power overnight and then be able to generate 24/7. So all those technologies that make, I would say, renewables more reliable are critical, but there's also, there's also debate on how to make natural gas cleaner. And I would say that the most important angle is how clean is your production of natural gas? Are you using fresh water or not? Is it shale gas or not? When you're liquefying that natural gas, what source of energy are you using? Are you using a fuel-based or hydrocarbon-based power generation in order to liquefy that natural gas, putting it in a ship and sending it to Europe? Or are you actually using renewable energy to produce that natural gas? What are your emissions related to the production of natural gas? So there's so much to do in having, let's call it, cleaner natural gas while that energy transition advances. So I think that should be the focus. And obviously, there's also the discussion about new, let's call it, clean fuels. There's a lot of talk about hydrogen, where, it's still in very early stages. There's a lot of talk about renewable natural gas. So I would say those are early phase technologies. It's yet to be seen if they're scalable and they're economic, but there are a lot of very tangible things that the large oil companies can do about producing cleaner natural gas as it continues to be kind of a base fuel for the energy transition. And then on the second question around private sector, is a private sector pushing that move towards climate change in Latin America? I would say definitely yes. And I would have to say particularly because a lot of global companies are present in Latin America. Unfortunately, the local companies are in many cases still the smaller companies, Bimbo, of course, being a wonderful exception to that rule, a Mexican company that's now leading global companies. But these global companies are really working with the governments to make that change. Now, are the Latin American governments in general moving as quickly as they should? I would say, unfortunately, no, it's not a rule across Latin America, but current focus, as we all know, is much more on, let's call it, on the immediate solution of social problems and political tensions rather than this long-term view. But I think, again, the fundamental economic drivers are there, and the private sector is playing a critical role.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Maybe talking again about the private sector, I also see a lot of movement between chambers and between associations to explain to the different small companies how measure your impact in carbon. How can you reduce your carbon impact? So I really see a lot of movement in terms of the private sector to move across these actions. You, as already talked about, as my partner talked about, all the things that we are moving in terms of global companies, but also the local companies trying to understand. The first step is to understand your carbon footprint to do something. If you hear like the all the issue about climate change, maybe it's gonna be like overwhelming to hear all about that. So one of the things that I hear from the Consumer Goods Forum, the different chambers working to have a better understanding in the different small companies, how to measure this and how to work to reduce your carbon footprint. So in Latin America, it's working in a lot of these things, the different stakeholders.
Thank you. So let me chime in on a few points. So I want to follow up a little bit with Tanya's earlier intervention, talking about what MDBs can do and sort of helping governments on that longer term path, or how to think through the issues. And it is something we're taking on in the World Bank. It's one of those evolutions that now climate change is seen and understood as an integral part of our overall mandate. So our goals are reducing poverty and shared prosperity, and it's not any longer or work on climate change, or which one comes first. And I think, as you heard in the previous panel, there's this evolution roadmap we're talking about, sort of what comes next for the World Bank. And a big part of that is understanding how these global public goods, like climate change, play into our goals around poverty. And so I think that's there in every country of the world over the next few years. And we've started last year a new study called a Country Climate and Development Report. The idea is that to look at the two together, because they integrally come together. In that report, we look at the impacts in the countries, what their institutional setup is to deal with climate change, what should be the priority reforms in areas of investment, how much it costs, and how to go about it. And so we've done the studies already in Latin America and Argentina and Peru. We have a couple others that'll be released this month. So those are really that recognition of what can we do to help governments and countries understand how climate change is playing out in their overall trajectory going forward, and really bring out priorities. And so that's been a contribution I'm proud of, and I think one that will help in the global que hacer, as we say in Spanish. So regarding minerals, it's a huge issue for Latin America. The data always shocks me. So Latin America has 58% of the world's lithium resources and 48% of the world's copper resources, both critical minerals for the transition to decarbonized economies. From our studies, Argentina, with the right investments and performance, could capture 19% of the world's lithium market in the next years. Those are huge numbers and huge economic opportunities. So how they do it will be a big part of that. How they manage the water resources, because it takes a lot of water to produce this stuff, but also how they manage the social implications. And I agree with our colleague in the audience who said, often local people don't benefit. So when we have intervened, we do develop benefit sharing plans. When we do things like carbon credits for maintaining forests, we do benefit sharing plans. They're intense, they take time. You're trying to give benefits to people that are largely disenfranchised, but it can be done. No, but it is a critical part of getting sustainability, because it's stopped down mining in many places. So with regards to the islands, and I agree, it's critical, and it's something we heard a lot about in the last panel. I think importantly for Latin America, the dynamic in the islands of the Caribbean is a little different than the Pacific and South Asia, because we don't have as many low-lying islands, so it's not so much submersion as it is the risk to coastal erosion and coastal destabilization. Hurricanes, all those kinds of things, and heat will impact the islands. So a couple of things that we really talk about is how to strengthen their coastal areas. One of the most cost-effective investments is mangrove restoration. I know it sounds wonky, but it's super cost-effective. It's a nature-based solution that we encourage all islands to look at, as well as land use planning. So a lot of the islands in the Caribbean have intense tourism resources and assets, but we looked in some of the islands, almost all the hotel resources are right on the coast that are most vulnerable. So how are they doing their land use planning to really protect their assets and protect their economies going forward? Financing, they need money. You heard about it in the last panel. Capacity, so it's not just a matter of scale in the islands, it's capacity to really manage investment, manage transformation. They have huge levels of debt, so we talk a lot about how to get financing to these countries, but they're all up to here in debt. So what are you really doing? How much more money can you lend to these countries? And then finally, their ability to withstand shocks. And Prime Minister Motley always has this really good point about having disaster clauses in all their financing. So when can you pause the repayment of financing when they get hit by a disaster? And we've seen it time and again in the islands that they sort of get on a good path and then they get whacked by one or two big hurricanes and then they're totally destabilized again. So how can we get them on a more sustainable path? So thank you.
Just a couple of things. Okay, so those were just building on that, and I won't go back into any of the pieces that already very well got explained. On the comment on Anglo-American about social, about the kind of wrapping in the social piece, I think it's a trend I didn't note, but I do think that, and we write about this a lot at Eurasia Group, is the upcoming focus financially on social and how that's going to be wrapped in to the ESG. Like E has definitely the E, environment, S, social, G, governance. The E has gotten all the highlighting, but the S is coming in pretty hot right now, I would say. And it's coming in, I think, in your world, it's going to be a really big focus. Of course, human rights in the mining world is going to be a big focus. I think you're going to see that. It'll come up in the apparel sector. It's going to be another one that it's going to have a really big focus. In terms of the adaptation jobs that you were talking about, sometimes that adaptation has been really difficult. When you look at all of the finance for climate, it's very strongly toward mitigation, although, I would say the World Bank has done an amazing job at getting more adaptation or more finance over to adaptation. But part of the reason in the private sector part of the financing is that it's hard to have a private sector adaptation project, because a lot of times the adaptation is changing a process or changing a location or changing so that you're not actually adding jobs, you're just shifting what they're doing. You're building, you're not putting a big development in a water stressed area or in a coastal area like Anna just noted, you're putting it somewhere else. So it's a little hard on the adaptation jobs. I'll just note that. Getting over toward I just wanted to hit Chris's point about our companies and countries seeing these opportunities. And I know this is going to be totally unsatisfying. The answer is it depends. It depends on the country. I mean, I think you're seeing some definitely taking advantage. And one of the casualties of this is the politicization of climate, right? So some countries are seeing the economic opportunities which are there, and some are like, look, I am absolutely opposed to believing in climate, and so I'm not going to believe in it, and that's the way it goes. I'd say in Latin America, some of the leaders, just some examples from Latin America are Colombia has really taken a leadership role in a few areas like green buildings. It's really like the way that they've been able to monetize green buildings has been pretty phenomenal. Public transport has also been really, and that's not something that I think that's something more that's a service, but they've really been able to get financing. I would say they've been very successful in getting financing for public transport. And then of course in Brazil, you saw, Lula talking about the opportunities that they might have to monetize their natural assets for carbon offsets. I know that he's got other things on his mind at the very moment, but I think that that's one area that you're seeing the wheels turning on how you can monetize and how you can take advantage of some of the opportunities. I think it's also notable that most of these economies were built on different industries, and those are the incumbent industries. So it's always really hard to shift because you have your incumbent industries holding a lot of the power. I think that was all I was going to say.
Okay, well, thank you very much, and and thank you all for taking time of your busy schedule. And in the case of the people here, of a very beautiful spring day in DC, it's very very insightful, and I think I feel a bit more optimistic about where we're headed. But with that, let me turn it over to our host, Alejandro, and again, reiterate how grateful we are for hosting and the effort that his team, Caitlin and Denise have put. So, Alejandro, thank you.
Thanks, Daniel, and thanks for a great panel. And thanks everybody for coming. And I want to thank Eurasia, Sempra, for also being a sponsor of this event, and obviously the team at Eurasia and at Georgetown Americas Institute for putting this together. Thanks.
I just